cities to have the little
That
R.
was all right.
So uh, let's start off where we. So I'm recording now. Let's start off where we. Well, first off, since we did more formal, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Welcome back to Zen Islam. It's been almost a year since we talked. It's been about 8 months, nine, something like that. And the world is more chaotic, perhaps about 30-40% more chaotic, something like that. Um, and I hope you're doing well. Nice to have you.
Thank you. Yeah, no, pleasure to talk with you. Excited to talk about a couple of things that have been on my mind and that I think we have common interests in.
Yeah.
I don't know if would you want to start with talking about.
Oh, well, what I
We could
wanted to
start with.
start with, just as a quick note, is why we are continuing to not show our faces. And I interviewed Wahid Azal about a month ago, and he said, "Nice attitude, man." So it came up, right? And he's, he's like a
The
dedicated
video.
sheikh, and he's very bold and so on. But as I've contemplated that, I was thinking about, I should start showing my face. It'll probably boost my numbers, which are very low and very niche, which is okay with me. This is not, this was never even about obviously getting income for ficky reasons. I would like to reach more people, but there's this thing with images. We don't really believe in that the Aisha hadith and the Muwatta means that it's like a major sin to have images, and obviously everyone's got the photography exception, which has crept into the fiqh before cameras were ubiquitous. Generally, the Salafist status quo of the 80s and 90s and 2000s said, it's like a major sin to take a photo, to do a selfie or something, except for in a passport if you have to do it. And it's like, well, why would God make exceptions? And this is whatever. So people don't really believe that anymore. Zakir Naik had a video about how they deliberated over this in like 2011 for a conference, and they ended up putting their faces on a billboard, and they did very well. And they were like, okay, great. So fine, we don't really believe in this start. And then there are later handball era hadiths that are like, oh, it's like one of the three. It's as bad as shirk, so it's like beyond a major sin, right? But one thing I've contemplated, Schreib had a video about this where he was reviewing a clip from another Sunni sheikh, is how when we show our faces, even if it's just a guy making a speech, like let's say Hamza Yusuf, and Ida Buxel had a review of Hamza Yusuf sort of, you know, trashing Quranists in a high adapt fashion as Hamza Yusuf is wont to do. And he was like, "What a good looking guy." He kept going on about that. He's like, "He's a really handsome guy," because he's like a
It's handsome.
sure. Well, a lot of people are handsome, um, but whatever. I mean, the
I'd
point.
like to say health is
Well,
handsome, right?
a lot of people
Any
who have
healthy
YouTube
individual.
channels are handsome, right? Um,
Sure.
but the point being that that's problematic because somebody being good looking, and men have a non-homoerotic thing where, like, if an entrepreneur has like bigger muscles, you're gonna like want to put your money with him because he's like this ape, that is like, okay, this is like an alpha ape. I can get in on this.
Sometimes we get inspired by that as well as men, right? It encourages us in a way.
But my point is that this can be not necessarily shirk or idolatry as sort of a lesser gradient of shirk, but it's in the spectrum because it biases us. And what we should really be doing is peering into the truth. But the other thing is I've been contemplating, like, what can I do with anonymity? And one thing I can do is raise money from Sunnis who don't know, if I like cool it with the Twitter with my public identity and I just keep it to Reddit, YouTube as Aleph Funk, then I can theoretically go to Qatar and pitch them and raise tens of millions of dollars at some point. That's kind of interesting. And they're not UAE, right? I don't agree with everything about Qatar, but like at least I wouldn't be a munafiq going to them for money like I
You
might be
know,
with some other
even
countries.
after our conversation, I didn't follow you on Twitter because I wasn't sure if you wanted those connections to be apparent because I use my real name on Twitter. But
Yeah,
your Twitter account became recommended to me without me even looking. So there's these
because I've been
algorithms
very
like,
active in kvetching and like
well,
I
I
had
think
an
it
in,
was a Bitcoin scene. That's where you popped up on some of those halal Bitcoin conference stuff like that.
yeah, right.
That scene.
So and then the other thing is that Muslims are so like the Muslim despots are so incompetent at intelligence network war type
Right.
stuff
Yeah,
that
for sure.
you really, eventually, like Mufti Abu Layth's real name is out. Like some pissed off guy who's obsessed will like dox you or whatever. But
Yeah, that was terrible.
compared to like Palantir and Mossad and like every phone is a spy for the Dajjal, basically for the genociding people. Like the mushrik element is not so, not to say they're all mushriks, but just to simplify, the kuffar have much better capabilities than the mushrikeen have, and so I can probably just use this compartmentalization. I don't have to even think about it very much. And the other thing is that I've had. Well, first off, how was your Ramadan?
That's a great question. Well, in my local community, we've just opened up the masjid. It's a pretty small town.
Oh
We're
wow.
kind of outside of a. It's not a small town. We're kind of a suburb of Tacoma, somewhat Tacoma, Washington. So big city there,
Hmm.
huge masjid, Tacoma. But we're kind of on the outskirts, and it's a newer masjid. They just purchased the property in December, I believe, and it was fantastic. I love being part of a small masjid. It's great because you get to know everyone, and you don't feel like you're coming into like, I don't know, if you were a new kid in high school going into like 4,000, 5,000 kid school, very hard to make friends. But if you go into a small high school, right, pretty easy to recognize faces. So we had a really lovely masjid in this blossoming community. It's awesome to be part of it when it's first growing. I feel like there's a lot of blessings to be had when you're at the foundation of something like that, a small masjid. Just thinking of how
MashaAllah.
many future generations are going to be benefiting from it potentially, and um, yeah, it was fantastic to be part of that. We went to iftar almost every night, 3 or 4 times a week for sure, and there'd only be like
Oh, that's
60
lovely.
people, 70 people. Everyone comes out of the woodworks in Ramadan, right? If you can't
Yeah,
speak to their hearts, you can speak to their stomachs, right? And
the
so
Easter Christmas Catholics is the
yeah,
Ramadan
exactly,
Muslims.
same thing. And
Yeah.
it's a shame because I meet so many cool people during Ramadan, then I never see them again until next Ramadan. So I don't know what you can do, but
Well, I'm glad you appreciate the
it's
blessing of both having the access instead of having to drive all the way into Tacoma, as I
oh
imagine
yeah,
you've done, and
huge.
then so the gas and the tolls,
I'm
and
I'm
I
I'm
had a
10 minutes
car
from it.
accident. It was a minor car accident on the Eid de Dajjal, as I call it, the Saudi fake Eid,
Oh
and
no,
it had
that
just
was a huge
freshly.
controversy.
Yeah, yeah. And so my friends from my local humble Musalla, even though it's owned land, so in a fiqh sense, it is technically a masjid. And I guess it doesn't have a dome, but there, whatever. But yeah,
Ours is a residential home with a garage. The men's musalla is in the garage, and the women's is in the main house. So
well,
it's
that's
very
a
humble.
nice change of pace. Usually the
Garage,
women
I
are in
it's
the janitor closet, and the men are in the living room, right? Kind of a thing.
yeah, it's not ideal, but it's all right.
No, but I think there's a great baraka in the humility, and there's an early story about this, and they decided it was like makruh, if not haram, to put in gold and other adornments. This is probably where the no gold and silk hadiths kind of percolated out of, is this general theme of, how posh do we want to go with this stuff? And it's like it's actually very un-Muslim to decorate the masjid extensively because that's money that could be spent on the poor and so on, right? So that's
It's
my
still expensive, even in this humble setting.
well, and
It's a lot of money, of
if you don't
course.
develop like a little apartment building on the land or something and have it perpetual
Right.
cash flow from it, then it is a money sink to just have, whether it's a big one or a small one, just affects the
Yeah.
scope. There's
No, we
depreciation, there's the electric bill, you got a full-time imam, etc. Um,
okay.
so yeah, inshallah, this will be a financial headache for me in the future because I would also very much like to build a masjid. And I was only able to go to like four iftars, something like this, and and then I've incurred. Let's see, the car odyssey is like $500 for that accident. It could have been more, but
Okay.
I found a good set of rims that because they're non-standard rims. I don't want to bore people with this, but basically they globalized the year after the make year of my car, and so the OEM rims are not fitting anymore. There's no second market for this. I had to like get a little creative. So that was fun, and then in addition to like my baseline is probably like I want to say maybe 100 odd bucks on gas and fees trying to do Ramadan events, right? So spending in the path of Allah. But the plus side is there are very few Muslims in my country, which means that the only real way that Islam is going to grow in Chile is, even if they all started getting second wives and they made more money and there were businesses stamping, work visas for men and they're like sort of immigration jihading people, they're only going to grow the population from like 5,000 to 7,000 over years of effort, right? So the
How
only
was your
way to,
Spanish? I wonder.
what's that?
How was your Spanish after being there for some time now?
Oh, I lived in Argentina as well. So I've been in Latin America for, like my whole adult life, basically for about 18
Oh,
years.
so you can
So my
speak it pretty
Spanish
well, I'm
is
sure.
It's just fine. Yeah, sure. And the guys from Iraq and so on, they all speak Spanish as well. It's
That's
not a
amazing.
difficult
It must
language
be. Well, it sounds.
compared.
I'd love to see a Latin American Islam. It sounds fascinating.
Well, so I've been to a masjid in Peru and Lima. That was a bit more lively. Argentina has about 400K Muslims, many of whom are in Buenos Aires, a
400.
very centralized but expansive country.
Okay.
But they're all dense in that area. I haven't been to a masjid there. I haven't visited since I became a Muslim. I haven't visited in like 4 years, actually. Kind of over Argentina. I got like enough of it. It's expensive now, so there's no compulsion for me to want to go. There's a few million in Brazil, and um, and then interspersed around. I think there's like a couple of masjids in Bolivia. So it's generally speaking, with the exception of Argentina and Brazil, it's pretty small. The Radio Chile Islam is a Saudi funded Dawah project. They have one big masjid in Santiago with a dome, and like nice architecture and everything. And it's a Salafi guy, who's the imam of that masjid. And then, mine that I go to, well, both of them are pretty small, and then there's a very small Shia community, and then I think there's some Naqshbandi presence as well. And I would have, initially I would have gone to hang out with them, and then I got in with the Quranists, and then and listening to like Sheikh Nurjan talk about how Muhammad is the logos, which is kind of a crude simplification of the Hakikat Muhammadiyya sort of Neoplatonist Akbarian concept. I guess it got.
Watching on the YouTube channel clickbait kind of creeps me out sometimes too.
Well, Nurjan
You
has
know what I'm
been
referring?
particularly effective. I'm not backbiting. I want to give him credit. They've done a really good job. When I converted, I was watching his channel and it was quite fanciful, but I was learning things and whatever. I ultimately left because he was saying the Dajjal's gonna tell you to worship God alone, and I was like, wait, well, this is a bit much. But they had about 130K subs, and now they have about 10 times that. Um,
I can't. I did not. I'm just looking at it right now as we're talking. I had no idea they had 1.4 million.
I was one. I said that's 100K since I checked
It's
about six
incredibly
weeks ago.
impressive.
So
Yeah,
so maybe what they're doing is they're botting YouTube accounts, and if you look at their comments, so this is like the latest thing, and this is another thing we can touch on is AI. Like I've been using AI to make my business work instead of having a
everyone.
team.
Right.
I just raise
Yeah.
money and I pay myself and I use the AI as my junior and now intermediate dev. And I've become a better dev in the process. So it's not like a mutually exclusive thing. And now the AI just came out, it's getting better. And I'm noticing on socials that the bots, they usually have very shallow comments. They're like, oh, yeah, all right, and kind of, because it's safe stuff. But we might get to a point in 5 years where synthetic personality agents will certainly take over business, at least the first touch point layer of business. And then authenticity will become more valued and so on. Maybe we'll take over government. And so my theory is that Sheikh Nurjan is like, he's talked about how he thinks this is like jinn technology, which is, he's not alone in that take. Um, but he's also talked about how the Suleiman alayhi salam story says that it's halal to command jinn. It's not as simple as that. It's haram
Mhm.
because he did it. So it's like a sunnah. So you can use AI. So my theory is that his young Marids were like, Sheikh, we got to use agents and bought a bunch of
All
new
this
YouTube
thumbnails are
accounts,
great.
boost our subs
Sure.
artificially, boost our engagement, and that way we'll hack the algo. And then they have legitimate, culty people who are just like, oh, Muhammad, our heavenly father. It's like Gospel of John Islam, and so what's the difference between a bot? If your average follower is like pretty basic, then it's easy for a bot to ape that style, and pad out your comments and so on. And this, like, the YouTube algorithm has not adapted to this. Neither has X. X or Twitter, as I like to dead name it, is quite dominated by this sort of thing. But maybe I'm wrong. Maybe it's all legitimate traction. But either way, he's very smart about marketing. Um, and I
It's
guess
been a
the
couple of
YouTube
years since I
algorithm.
really looked at this. When I
Sorry, you go
first
ahead.
became Muslim, when I first became Muslim, it was certainly one of the things that popped up back in 2019 or so, 2018.
So why would
So
Google
yeah, he
like
had.
Sheikh Nurjan? That's the question.
I think he got in there pretty early to YouTube, or no,
That's true.
like, where's his? Let me look his oldest video.
Right. So it took him about a decade or 8 years to get to 100 plus K subs. And then these things have natural convexity in there. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. But do you think that the Google people are like in a Dajjalic plot to promote
I
Naqshbandiya?
don't think so.
Okay.
Certainly, his
Um,
oldest video is 18 years ago, almost
yeah, he
20
would do the
years on
voice
YouTube.
reverb. Their production values,
That
they
means
didn't have the AI images and the thumbnails, but
no, he got here almost when YouTube went public, which was like 2005. He's almost been here the whole time, so maybe that has
yeah,
something. Over 3,500 videos, which is crazy.
I had a YouTube channel back in that era, and I worked with Michelle Phan before she was a YouTuber. I got her to make video game art for free for me, and then she was kind of flaky, but then she like came back. I was at GDC and the Game Developers Conference, and she came back. She texted me, and she was like, "Oh, I want to work on video games with you again." And I was just like, "Man, Michelle Phan is so flaky." And so I did not, I knew that she was going to be big. I knew she was going to be a star, but I kind of ultimately just, I should have like signed an income sharing agreement with her for like 10 grand or something. And just whatever she did, it was going to be big. But anyways, so, okay.
Some
So
of
we had a
our
good run.
the main. I guess, go on. Sorry.
No, no, I was kind of truncating that. It was too much tangent. I was like 3 levels deep. What were you going to say?
I was just say, uh, as far as I'm like there was like three things we kind of, or two things that I was thinking like is mainly on our menu. That's like Mutakalam slash Zaidi and your exploration of these two things, and then
Yes.
Muhammad Knight's book. And I don't know which one you'd want to open up first.
Very good. Yes. Well, keeping us on track. I appreciate that. So the the book I am a Salafist. I'm going to title this "We're Salafists Now"
Why
because you
I'm
got
a
it.
Salafist or
No, we're
Salafi.
not. But the point is that you need a clickbaity thing to get anywhere on YouTube. It's kind of the summary
Oh
of
yeah,
the previous section. So, what is the ironic twist in this book?
you're asking me. Um,
I'm asking you. Yeah, I mean, you read it.
I have my notes open on the book. The main. Let me look at my notes real quick. The main twist. I mean, he kind of gives it like this weird postmodernist, like Salafism is can be whatever you want it to be sometimes, and it seems to be him reconciling like this quote here I have. It says, "My Salafism diagnoses a problem but gives no cure, because Salafism cannot survive its own critique. There's more than one way to bulldoze a shrine. If everything is bid'ah, this includes the Salafiyah themselves, along with the pre-modern heroes whom they glorify as defenders of the real." And that's pretty early on in the book. That's one of the notes I have that I think kind of
Okay, so let's
characterizes.
unpack that. I mean, that's all true. Like the Shia, the Twelver Shia are also very anti-Bida, not the Ismailis so much because it's like whatever the Imam says. Bida is not really a relevant concept, but the even though they're really into the theopathic Jafari and Taqiya Jafari hadiths, but Jafar also has these anti-Bida hadiths. So it's an interesting thing I've been studying as I've been studying Shiism a lot this last Ramadan, and I read the Musnad Zaid, and I read a bits of Al Kafi. It's a much bigger collection.
Not Zayd. Tell me, what's that?
The Musnad Zaid is the sort of Muwatta Malik for Zaydis, but it's much later dated, and so it's attributing
Okay.
everything is Zayd, the I guess great grandson of Ali alayhi salam, going back to Ali. So it's sort of like, what if Ali was al Shafi and was like expressing ideas in Shafi's Risala, and therefore it turns out that Shiism is really sort of like being a Shafi. Uh, so I really suspect it's false because it has very mature um, sort of second and third century Hijri fiqh concepts that are just formulated directly put in Ali's mouth. Plus, it has extra egregious immoralities that are considered, you know,
Example in English.
the religion by many people, sadly. Um, so that's my review of Zaydiism. Like low imamology is cool, and Zaydiism is cool for showing us that that exists and that you don't have to like go way down the esoteric rabbit hole like the Ismailis. The Ismailis are also interesting because just anybody who's like, oh yeah, Shiism is not just these people who have it's sort of like the 12er Shias are the Salafists of Shiism, and because Shiism is a smaller pond, it was easier to do that. Whereas the Salafis have pushback from like Ashari Malikis, like Shadi al Mazri, who still has somewhat intolerant, you know, classical opinions shared by
And
Ibn
I was
Kathir.
actually thinking of bringing him up today as well. Actually,
Oh yeah,
they don't know. I was thinking about. Yeah, I've been actually taking some of their courses on
Shadi Al Mazri's
constructing.
online school.
I've been listening to some of them while at work, um, but maybe we'll get to that a little later, perhaps.
Okay,
Um,
but the point is that
um,
there's a tension between like Al Mazri's a little bit more Ibn Kathiri than who's a Tamiyan, obviously, right? He's a student of Ibn Tamiya, than Hamza Yusuf and Tim Winter, Abdul Hakim Murad.
you said Al Masri is a student of. Taymiyyah or Ibn Kathir's?
I'm saying, like, for instance, the thing that I don't dislike everything Al-Mazri says. Sometimes I think he
Yeah,
has
of
pretty
course.
good
I mean, I
taste.
don't like everything he says either. Yeah, he's kind of
But
yeah.
well, one thing
Go
he
on.
says is you're a kafir if you believe that 569 is a Mubin verse, right?
Five
Um,
sixty nine.
the open inclusive salvation. Um,
Yeah, I don't agree with him on this aspect at all. I think he's completely wrong in this. And I think
but the point is that he didn't come up
his
with that,
state.
right? Like Ibn
Yeah,
Kathir codified it in his tafsir. It had been in the Mamluk era, maybe 100 odd years before. It had been codified in the fiqh understanding. Um, Al Ghazali was more on the fence about it, trying to give it intermediate. So this is where you get the Hamza Yusuf type thing. And then going back further, someone like Al-Farabi was more like what they would call a perennialist. So the thing is, like a Muslim perennialist isn't really a perennialist in the same way that like a Muslim feminist isn't really a feminist because a feminist believes in like capital E equality, and a Muslim feminist, as my wife puts it, believes in the Geneva Convention for the patriarchy. So fair enough, right? So if you're a Muslim perennialist, it's like you believe that the Quran means what it says about these groups, and whoever believes in God in the last day, they're not disqualified. So the good deeds really matters. This is like Khalid's, like many people's take, and many converts who have non-Muslim families. This is like the only. First of all, it's the Mubin reading, and second of all, it's much harder to stomach the idea that God is is merciful and just, and yet is
well, yeah.
disqualifying.
When I first became Muslim, I remember interacting with a young Muslim, quite used in his teens, late teens. She
Oh,
was
hey, can you
answering like,
speak into the mic a little bit more strongly, a little bit more closely?
"Sorry, is this okay?
Oh, beautiful.
Can you
Yeah,
hear me
this
now?"
is just improve the video, improve the sound
Excellent.
effect. Okay, great. Go on.
When I first became Muslim, I remember being asked by a young Muslim brother. We were talking about my family, like how does it feel knowing that they'll all go to hell? And I, I was like, what? Like, are you?
Feels
What a
great,
strange
bro.
question to ask.
Yeah,
What a strange question to ask. And I had no con. I was like, it was very confusing to me. And I was like, well, I don't remember what I said. I think I just dismissed it without getting into it. I was pretty fresh, but
sure.
there's also studies about the more there's social studies about people's inclusivity in salvation, salvific inclusivity in regards to how wide their social circle is. Like if somebody interacts with people of different faiths, their salvific circle gets wider and wider the more people they know. And this is like that's how I understand it.
I'm
Like
pretty sure you
if you
brought
don't
that
have
up
anybody,
last time we spoke.
oh, interesting. Okay, yeah,
Yeah.
it's something. Anytime this topic's brought up, it reminds me of it. I'll have to find the actual study. I'll look for it. But anyway, yeah, that's obviously ridiculous to think that Christians and Jews don't have a chance. You know, it's absurd to
Try
me.
to stay close to the mic so we can keep it.
Yeah, here, if you give me one moment, I can try out this other mic.
Oh,
Just
okay.
give me less than 1 minute.
Well, while you're doing that, I'll just add my color. I don't blame, for instance, Atheries, right? So it's the same sort of algorithm at work here. I don't blame Atheries for being Atheries because even though I think dimly of it, but I don't think they're kufar. Neither does Al Sunnah, because there are mubin readings of these verses that we presume are metaphorical, that God's agency is writing the Torah with his hand, right? And so they believe in like a literal transmission, the literal text, the literal language, everything's literal, including obviously the hand. So they're not rejecting the Quran by choosing a Mubin interpretation. We might think they're naive. Likewise, if you beat your wife, I think that's pretty bad, but maybe Allah would be more forgiving of that oppressive sin because you could misunderstand that mutashabihat verse. Um, Nobody's, literally abandoning their wives in their beds because there's an iddah period. So that's been delineated in fiqh by other verses,
How
right?
is this? How's this mic? Is this better?
Oh yeah, that's better. Great.
Excellent,
So
excellent.
reading
Yeah,
is hard. People aren't that smart. And so when you read, the deen in the eyes of Islam is, in the eyes of Allah is Islam, and whoever chooses religion other than Islam, it will not be accepted of them. Of course, you're going to think, well, Islam is this institutional, Sunni umbrella, which is broad enough that it's got room for ikhtilaf. Therefore, I'm pretty sure that maybe you think Shias, there's a slippery slope to takfiring Shias and everyone else who isn't, you know. But at least there's that ecumenical umbrella, and people are kind of chill about it. So it's a general problem of parsing things, and in this case, they chose one verse that is mubin, that you have to that your deen must be Islam, must be submission to God. You
you're referring
can't.
to Imran 85. Whoever seeks a way other than Islam.
Yeah, yeah. They always bring
This
that
one,
one up.
yeah, it's ومن يبتغي غير الإسلام دينا فلن يقبل منه وهو في الآخرة من الخاسرين. The word here for whoever seeks uh something other than Islam is uh يبتغي, and يبتغي the it's also that word in the Quran. If I had a concordance here with me, one I can find other verses which that verb is used. It's related to like resentment, and like it's more of an aggressive word.
Oh, interesting.
Yabtaghi. And so when Allah says, it's like whoever is like angry towards, I'll find a concordance. Give me 30 seconds. Yabtaghi is also used in, let's see. Uh, Well, it's to seek, but it also is, let's see here. It's like related to another root word that's related is baga, which is like, let's see,
But the point is,
oppression
seek,
and
as in like I went on
rebellion.
the internet and then I chose Buddhism, is like that's what happened with my wife, right?
Right.
Is
No, it's
not
more like here.
descriptive.
Here's a verse in Shura verse 42. Uh, you only have a way against those who oppress the people, and yabaguna fil ardi bighayri al those who rebel in the land without right. So this word, when it says يَبْتَغِي غَيْرَ الْإِسْلَامِ دِينًا, I think it's more like somebody who's actively going against submission to God, right?
So a
It's not
better
just like
translation might be like whoever contests
res-
away,
contest. Yes, yes, yes. That's perfect, I think. Yeah,
because the
absolutely.
peace would be like the Islam would be like not being a terrorist, and
Right.
maybe trying to reform your home country to have the geopolitical power to conduct more of a just war to achieve jihad instead of doing Hutbism. And so then you seek a way other than Islam by blowing yourself up in a public venue, right? Um,
I want to get your thoughts on this quote from Muhammad Knight. Early on the book, he says, I am not interested in, this is page 17, I am not interested in the conspiracy theorists who claim that 80% of US mosques have fallen under the Wahhabi influence, nor the self appointed voices of moderation who would marginalize Salafism by saying that it accounts for only 3% of Sunnis. He says Salafism is not an empirically measurable quantity. I'd wonder about your experience with Salafia, or how do you, because I contrast this with Umar Lee, who was interviewed by Tehran Pool, the Skept Islamica, a while back. And Umar Lee, who's pretty keyed in on
he's like that
Islamic
cool dude
culture in
from
the
St.
US.
Louis.
Exactly, yeah. He's
I
pretty
like
keyed
that
in
guy.
on
Yeah,
Islamic culture in the US. I like him a lot. And he claims that Salafia is like the default in US Islamic culture. And I tend to agree with him, really.
yeah,
I think like Islamic or U.S. masjids are, that's considered the Islam pretty much, like on the
right.
whole.
Kind of like how 12er
Would you
Shiism is
would you
like,
agree
just
with that?
call us the Shia because we're the majority. So,
Pretty much,
and they
yeah.
pulled it
And
off,
it's
and the
like
Salafists have pulled it off more in the exterior, more in the diaspora, but not quite the way
people
that.
might not even be aware of it.
like
They might
most
not even be
people are
aware there's a
kind of aware
conflict.
that there are these Saudi type guys. Now, of course, Saudi's changing, mashallah, for better or for worse, but it's changing. And then they're aware that there's like, they're kind of aware that there are like Sufis, and they're not maybe aware of this sort of moderated, blended down, more traditional, what you might call traditional Sunnism, which is like kind of chill, not so shirky Sufism in the Hazalian sense, right?
Strange how American Muslims are totally convinced of this, like a
Okay.
Sufi boogeyman, like the rejection of tasawwuf
If you,
in
if you
popular
can, real
American
quick,
Islam is astounding.
1 second, I just got to move so my kid can nap. Um, I guess I'll go to the car or something. So, okay,
Take a
first
nap.
off, a lot of the thorny things that we have foregrounded in Salafism are in what you would call quote unquote traditional Sunnism as it was codified in like 900s through Ibn Kathir's tafsir, let's call it, where we see the pimple of Salafism beginning to fester, right? Um, and yet that was still considered, mainstream reading of the Quran, right? So when you have so many
Sure.
Sunnis accepting tafsir ibn Kathir, it means that this proto-Salafism already impacted al Sunnah in the fundamentals, right? Um, so then Salafism is a little bit more vehement. We're going to come after these so-called Sunnis. They're Ahlul Bidah. They shouldn't have adab or whatever their contention is. That they shouldn't go to grave. Of course, it's overstated that people like they don't really do sujood to the graves. That's not the proper fiqh. If they do that, that's bad and that's a sin, and they should repent. But they just kind of it's like if you went to the Lincoln Memorial and then you turned away from the Lincoln statue and you prostrated towards Mecca because you were just like, oh, I'm so grateful for this. I'm going to do 2 raka nafil, right? But anyway,
Yeah.
so there is a prior influence of Salafism on the mainstream of Sunni Islam, and just Sunni Islam being in the enterprise of having empires, collecting land rents, bribing through systematically, not overtly, the ulema to justify their transgressions and repression, seizing slave women or boys by the thousands and saying that it's like you don't need a nikah and all this stuff. This was all Sunni Islam, the satanic man-made religion. No offense to the Sunnis, there's nice things in it. It's a big umbrella, but it has all this Satanism in it for a while. So Salafism is just leaning on a restorationist narrative that is common in Reformation movements. So you see it with like Seventh Day Adventists, for example, and they have there's some similarities there because they go to the Torah and they're like we should be following more of this Torah stuff. And there's some very hardcore. They don't lapidate women to death when they do extramarital sex, but the Seventh Day Adventists I quite like in many ways, but they can be a little bit more stringent, right? So Salafism takes this further, but what it really is this myth of the Salaf as good people. And so one thing I appreciate about the Shia, and as I've illustrated, the Shia have done the same thing, and this Walayat al-Faqih Iranian 12er Shiism being equated with Shiism is incorrect, and it's shirk. Walayat al-Faqih, even within the Shia framework of like it's not shirk to follow imams, it's not being a hadith rejecter essentially, right? It's the same logic. But Wilayat al-Faqih is like just complete. That's innovation, right? Like, oh, but I Ayatollah Khomeini am also going to have this authority, and then the rest is
Okay,
history,
the,
right?
the authority of the jurist, based on his
Yes,
book. Okay, yeah, it's a
and
second
they're a
book.
minority among
Yeah.
Shia. There is a growing. I feel like there are probably more anti-Wilayat al-Faqih Shia in Iran who may also be on like a step or two away from apostating from Shiism to Sunnism, or from Shiism to Christianity, or just from religion entirely because they're burned out. And this is another thing: is the burnout thing. We can unpack that. That's a whole topic. And so the question though
Shias
was
burnout or Salafia? What
Anytime
if you're a
you're in a
Shia
very
brother? Go
intensive
ahead.
mushrik cult enterprise, you're going to burn out because it's not natural, right? Um, it's not the way of Islam, right? Which is supposed to be peaceful at some level. Even when you're going in and risking your life to fight injustice, you're at peace. Um, so, anyways, do I think that Salafism has become the default? Yeah, I kind of do. I mean, in my little neck of the woods, um, you got the Hutbas coming from Saudi, and so they're Salafist in nature. But there's so much overlap with this more moderated Shadi al Masri red line set that it's this is why I was spending that time trying to nitpick at what the difference is. They're really it's really a chimeric outgrowth of the same golem of enterprising empires inventing religion to do oppression, right? And then
I would say Sharia al-Masri is certainly not in a Salafi vein, though.
no, but this is the point.
100%
My
not.
point is that they're on a spectrum, and that picking them apart is not so simple to do, right? So, like, for instance, there's a Shafi imam at the other masjid that has like 40, 50 people that go, and on Eid it's somewhat more. Um, and he's a nice guy.
My local imam is a Shafi'i as well, from Al Azhar, which is
Right. So Shafi
incredibly
is
intelligent man.
already deep enough down the shirk rabbit hole that not necessarily that they're all mushriks per se, right? I'm not being exclusivist here, but that, there's shirk in the fiqh. It's wrong. The algorithm is wrong. You can't put hadith next to the Quran. It's subordinated to the Quran, right? Um, so yeah.
I
So
wouldn't call
anyway,
them mushrik though. They're not
no,
mushrik,
I'm not
but
saying they're
that's another
mushrik. I
conversation.
didn't say mushrik. I said
Right.
that it's shirk, right? So for the Khalid set theory about shirk, which is a lot of people have trouble with.
Call it
It's
chronic Islam.
yeah, yeah. It's more like
Interesting.
shirk is sort of like
I've
if I
never
do
totally
charity
understood. I've
and then
tried to wrap my head around it,
I'll
and I
give you a
don't
simple
understand the
example. In the
distinction.
gospel,
Yeah.
there's the story about the wealthy guys coming in and they make big donations to the synagogue, and then the widow
Hmm.
comes in, and the widow gives like 2 shekels, and the Messiah goes like, "This is the real deal right here." To paraphrase, not to lie upon him by paraphrasing, but full disclaimer. But basically,
Purported.
doing a drunk history, not also not drunk, by the way. I don't drink, but
Sure.
fully Muslim hedging my statement. But yeah, I'm trying to make this a little easier for modern listeners to digest. But basically, if you're poor and you do charity, it's worth more. If you're rich and you do charity, it's worth less. It's more about the percentage and how much it hurts you.
That's a scale, right? Yeah.
And then so not even like a gross percentage necessarily, because still 10% of $1 million is less painful than 10% of $10,000, right? And then your intention. So a lot of Christians, like this neo-Ebionite guy, Doug, on the Jesus Words Only channel, he does not disclose his charitable giving on his tax return, and therefore he's overpaying on his taxes by the proportionality of that. And I imagine he's fairly charitable.
That's silly.
Um,
Oh,
and well, it's not silly to him because he's reading that story and he's interpreting it the way many Muslims interpret fiqh and other scriptural readings, was erring on the side of caution. He doesn't want to nullify his charity by disclosing it to anybody, right? So what the Quran does is it says public and private, though it's better if you public. So it gives you this nuanced gradient. And I wouldn't even say that putting it on your tax return is reducing your reward with Allah at all. But rather, if I talk about my charitable stuff sometimes in public settings because I want to do dawah. So I'm kind of betting a little bit that the reward from the good example will outweigh the diminishment of the reward. And then if my intention is like a Bill Gates or like a Sam Bankman-Fried, I don't know if you know him, the FTX jailed
I
founder.
don't think I do. No, no.
Well, he was really big into effective altruism, which is this secular,
Hmm.
hyper rationalist, do gooder
Well, maybe I read the
philosophy.
book. Actually, it's um, there's a book maybe he wrote called
He didn't
what
write
is
it.
it?
He
I
was
know the
busy
effective altruism thing.
defrauding people. But yeah, he
Okay.
was in touch with that author. Um, if you know the name, you could throw it in the ring. But
I'll find it because I actually really enjoyed that book. I read it.
Yeah, it's not like it's a bad idea, but what he did with it is he defrauded people. He did riba. He did obviously making money off of gambling, and took all
It
kinds of
was good, better,
shortcuts
I
on
think.
the rationale that he would, fund orphanages later, once he had, taken stolen from the rich sufficiently to be able to give to the poor in what seemed like a rational enough scale that it was satisfactorily effective. So there's no faith in like the small gift being counted by God, right? It's like, no, I have to, get to n billion. I have to get to like 10 or $20 billion, and therefore be able to put out like 3 billion liquid because 1 billion isn't going to be enough, which is a reasonable uh, spreadsheet to input there. So fair enough.
Like
In
as
order to,
a doing good,
systematically
do
affect things, because the material outcome is the only real outcome, is kind of an underlying part of that ideology. So anyway,
so
he created
doing
like a
good
$10 billion
better by
bankruptcy,
William.
and he ruined my hedge fund, and which helped me come to Islam, mashallah. And
I see. Well,
yeah, so that's a good example of what the Quran says is, planting your seed in shallow soil, right, versus planting it in a fertile hill, right? So intent. So Islam lets you know that it's not just about who happens to know about your charity, although that does weigh in on it. It's about, your intentions, right? Which also people get OCD about that too. But I'm like, okay, my
yeah, a
intentions
little bit.
are what they are. It's fine. I just keep trying.
Let's
My
see.
OCD phase as a
One
Muslim ended a
concept.
while ago. A lot of people will go through that. Did you go through an OCD phase?
Not too much, thank God. No, not terribly. I'm actually maybe on the opposite side.
You like too
Um,
lax?
maybe a little too much on the. I'm like, oh, did I get every crevice of my face during wudu? Maybe I don't know. I'm just gonna.
That's what I fear
No,
I've
I don't.
also become, but I don't know, being
I
OCD. A
don't
lot
think
of these
about
guys
it.
are. I don't think it helps
Um,
you to be good, to be
no.
too parent. You got to trust in God. The trust is a part of it. Um.
Yeah, 100%.
So okay. So
One
so
thing I
take
really like about Muhammad
yeah.
Knight's book, unless you want to keep going on this point.
Well, I just wanted to wrap it up, and I was so many levels deep because we were talking about because that's shirk, right? So rias is when this is the point of that this is core to the whole sort of neomatazili.
Rias?
It, yeah, rias, not kias, not to be confused with kias. Is
What is Rias? Oh, like using
rias is what
reason? Like Ray?
is known as minor shirk. Um, and it is
Rias,
when
minor.
you do something good, like go to the masjid, for example, to give a simple
Ria.
example.
With an Ain at the end. Ria. I see.
Yeah,
Okay.
you're good with the elocutions and the diacritics, bro. So you go to the masjid to be seen, so that they know that you are pious, which of course means you're less pious than you possibly could be, right? And that
Yeah,
means
that's a double. That's a
you
thing.
you won't earn hasanat for that deed, right? So that's a form of shirk that doesn't send you to hell, but it means you're kind of wasting your time, right? Um,
Yeah. I try
and
to circumnavigate this. I think a good antidote to that form because it can creep in sometimes. I think desiring to be in the company of the righteous. This is a good. You want to be around your brothers in faith, and I think this is it's a good intention. Going to
yeah,
the masjid. That's how because I could pray at home, but I desire to be in the company of people who are praying as well, and it's a good thing.
well, this is where people get into the OCD, is like they're second guessing
Yeah,
themselves, right? And then it becomes this like
right.
Shinji
That's tough.
Ikari recursion of like, but how do I know what myself is and what is how can I do I intend my intentions and all this stuff, right?
Yeah,
So there was a fiqh
it's
debate about this,
not
and
critique.
it was
It's a
like
serious thing.
if you go to the masjid, if you're walking to the masjid, you do your wudu because you're following hadith, right? So you do your wudu, and with every step, you're gonna get a sin forgiven, and then there's a little hasanat in the next step, and so on. Right. So you're
Yeah, it's
walking, you're
trouble.
not
It's
driving
not too
because they
good.
didn't have cars also, right? That's beta.
Right.
Just kidding. And this is like what Michael was saying. And then
Aurea means to show off. I see. It's like a showing off.
right, so you have this thought like, oh, like I need
Oh,
to get
maybe.
there on
Yeah.
time so that they think I'm like so good that I like make it in time for the Sunnah prayers, instead of just being like,
Right.
oh, if I'm late
Yeah.
for the Sunnah prayers, then I'll do them later, or whatever. And so the fiqhy thing is like, if you've thought that, you're already like you've already nullified your hasanah. And then there's like a more Hanafi probably type opinion of like, no, if you have that little waswas, and then you go, no, 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 like cleanse me of riyas, ya Allah, or something, like, right, or something like this, then you
They're
won't be
fine.
guilty of riyas, right? So this is where curing the OCD.
The famous one, right?
Yeah. But it's actually a really important point. And then the vice versa that Khalid extrapolates is that if I, let's say, cheat on my wife, right? It's pretty bad.
Mhm.
Just because I'm like, there's a hooker on the internet, a sex worker, and I want to just do that, right? That's fisk, right? It's a major sin, and then I'm going to repent of it, or I have no faith, right? Um, and that sucks. But maybe I'll be forgiven for it, because I'm gonna make a good toba for it. Maybe I'll make my toba, I'll confess to my wife, and then I'm gonna like really suffer, right? Then I'll feel like, well, I don't want to do that again. Right? It's not that fun. So that's kind of like fisk and toba, right? And so when you add the shirk, it's like I'm Muhammad hijab, and I'm going to cheat on my wife in a nikah. And the shirk is that these scholars, even though the Quran says that Allah loves those who are fair dealing,
Now they're ringing a bell with that stuff. Yep, I'm seeing where it's going. I
you're
recall. It's
familiar
been
with
a while
that
since I've
that
visited his.
little
Yes, I've
little
certainly watched
tabloid.
his videos on the topic. Yeah, I kind of have forgotten a little bit, or
But
didn't
there was a
totally comprehend it
controversy
at the time, to be
recently
honest.
where
Yes,
he actually,
I'm familiar with the Muhammad hijab thing. Yeah,
so instead of coming out and saying, "Look, I did this, but
I'm sorry.
I
Right,
wasn't
pretty simple.
rude." No, or not even that he's sorry. I didn't do anything wrong. Like I'm saying, this is still going to be pretty, but I'm saying he should have been like, I did this. I didn't do anything wrong. She's over exaggerating the extent to which I misrepresented my intentions. She consented to this nikah. It is halal to parameterize the nikah consensually. Like these are all true statements, right? Him doing it secretly without his wife's knowledge or consent is, and maybe the part about him being really transparent about what his params were, and she was just kind of swept up, and that might be untrue, but it's sort of like a he said she said thing, right? And there's no way to possibly prove it, and what it would do is it would reduce the whole scandal to pure hearsay and zon, right? But instead, what he's doing is he's like, I deny everything, and these people are this, and now here's a dirt package on this guy's ex-wife that who did the YouTube, and it's like, oh my god, and then I'm
Right,
bringing my friends into it, so everybody's like doubling and tripling down, and it just looks so pathetic. And the thing is,
it's a
it
terrible thing.
maybe it wouldn't be shirk if they were like, yeah, sure, I've read the Quran, right? I'm like a major Dawa guy, so I've read the Quran. And yeah, I guess the Quran, there's a lot of verses in the Quran, but I do recall that there's this part of Allah loves those who are fair in dealing. But my interpretation of the fiqh happens to overlap, and therefore I taqlid with these scholars whose opinions I reiterate and represent. And therefore, I truly believe that I operated above board according to the will of Allah, and I'm not an Aquinian, Mutazili, lib, cuck, whatever. Like I believe that if it's
Yeah,
stipulated as such, then that's the divine command, and you follow that, and that's what's good, and not what you namby-pamby feminists think is good, right? And if you take that position, you might be wrong, and you might be committing a sin anyway, right? Like Allah can still, it's not like anything you interpret is going to be accepted by Allah as not a sin or as but
isn't
that
it? Or
it,
let me. Is it
yeah,
that Khalid's interpretation is that if you're following a scholar to the point of doing fisk or something evil and
yes.
attributing that, like that's when it becomes shirk for Khalid, right?
Yeah, well,
Essentially.
and I guess in my reading of this hijab situation, which is just so funny. Oh, that's his
Wild.
name in this context. But anyway, in my reading of this, if he were very forthright about, this is my usooli interpretation of Islam, and there's a lot of tradition and so on, maybe it wouldn't even be shirk, right? I don't know. It would be,
I
but
see what
because he's
you.
being like, you know, who he is, the way he is about it, it's making things worse, and there's more sins being added. And heck, I might even be singing by backbiting him, even if everything I'm saying is justifiable. So we'll nip this in the butt. Um,
Yeah. Right.
so may not be the best example. Another example would be if well, murder is like we Khalid and I generally read that verse as meaning what it means, and that there's no like if unless you repent part of it
Of
about
course.
murder. Um, but like. there's a lot of people believe that killing non-Muslims is not murder in that level. So if I
That's crazy.
do
Yeah,
that, well, actually, this is
that's
too
so wild.
intense. So I'm trying to think of a good example where the stakes aren't so high, so we can weigh the differential. Okay, so like if I let's say I'm backbiting Muhammad Hijab right now, and I'm actually incurring a sin, and I'm exposing it, and I won't be forgiven for it.
Yeah,
Okay,
and then you attributed that to a scholar. The
but
reason why
I'm
you're
not
doing it
saying
is
that
that.
I'm not saying that actually backbiting is okay sometimes because of Ibn so and so. Yeah, that would be so. Therefore, I wouldn't
Right.
even have the possibility. So enough sinning on my part for trying to cite
Or
the transgressions of the Ummah for fiqh illustrative purposes. So okay, so it's just I think it's such an important point because everybody, including the Quranists, right? And this is the main thing is like why we're having this conversation, and what's germane is the Salafism. Like Mufti Abu Layth is a Salafist because he follows the Athar of Medina, right? And he has all these liberal takes based
Abulet,
on what.
he's not a Salafi.
No, he's not a Salafist, but in this postmodern deconstruction of the concept of Salafism, that is the thesis of M. Muhammad Knight's book. You would say that Mufti Abu Layth, in his way, is a Salafist because he's following these Salaf who are cited in the Muwatta Malik, right? Even though his
Yeah, but I think
fatwas are more
Mufti's
liberal.
deeply rooted in a pre-Salafi kind of. I don't know. I guess I
No,
don't
but the
know if I
point is,
necessarily agree with Muhammad Knight's interpretation of what a Salafi is, really, personally. But
okay, well, let's tease that apart.
um,
But let me play
here's my
Knight's
thought.
advocate here
Sorry.
by teasing it
Yeah.
out for the folks at home. So okay, so my interpretation of what he's saying is that because the Salafists are citing a supra traditional supremacy usul by saying that we already believe that all the companions are good because that's the basis of our whole hadith thing. So therefore, if we just do Islam the way they did, we'll be okay. That's basically Salafism. So it's a restorationist movement. And what Knight is saying is, well, everybody who pertains to that sort of authenticity is a Salafist in their own interpretation of what the Salaf were doing. So Mufti Abu Layth is saying, the Salaf of Medina did not have a women's section. There weren't separate entrances. So the Salafi insistence, we have this controversy every Ramadan. It's not just Salafis, it's Hanafis and so on, where women get turned away from masjids, and it's like, oh, what are we doing, right? This is not the way of the Salaf, right? And Mufti Abu Layth, I think, is factually correct about that. And then Quranists would say that we're Salafis because the real Salaf were following just the Quran, and like, yeah, the Hawarij were.
There's a
So for
very pertinent quote from Muhammad on that point, or
okay,
Knight on
yes,
that exact
not to be
point. Yeah.
confused with so many other guys. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. One moment. One- Sorry, I was getting a request about watering the garden out front, but where does he say this? Um, let's see. Let me find it. Man, I have the quote written down on my digital notes, but I can't find it in
Well,
the
I'll
physical
note
note.
by
He
contrast.
says
Okay.
I
Yeah.
he says just like the Salafia, Quran only Muslims reinvent the past to inscribe themselves at its center, insisting that what they advocate is not a reformation, but a revival of the original Islam. This is on
Right.
261, he
And
says.
you left Quranism sort of
Yeah,
mentally.
I would say, yeah, in a in a in a strong way, yeah. Definitely. I don't identify as a chronist anymore, really.
But you did for a while.
Mainly because I see it. I did for a long while. Although I was on the softer side of, I was more
Sure.
on the Khalid chronic Islam kind of Quran centricism, I would say, and I still identify with that strongly, Quran centric approach. But
Well, they're
I
certainly
think that
right about
mostly,
several things, at least.
yeah, certainly, and I guess I just saw it as another. It's this idea exactly what Muhammad Knight just said. They're kind of just a reformist movement trying to paint themselves as this is Islam, but Quranism can't exist without Salafiyah. really. It's a reaction to it. I see it. I see them as like two opposite forces that inform each other, or mainly the Quran alone is informed by Salafia and is a response to it, I think. And it makes it, it's like, how can I follow something that's ontologically like completely connected to Salafism, which itself is kind of like it's a non-organic Islamic movement, which they might have things that you can draw from and value, but I just see it as another. It's just a social historical movement, not really like a an authentic like a. It might point towards the truth, but it's not the be all end all of Islam, right? I can't just. There's more to it than this, and you got to
Yes.
engage with the tradition in some way, even if it's to critique it. If you don't, if you don't have a foot in it, you don't really have much ground to critique it or to work with it.
Well, and I want to
And I
note
just
that
see this as really important.
I don't assert my post-Quranist take of what I call neo-Mutazilism, which is going to differ from other people's take on it to some extent. Like they probably don't emphasize Ali or Injil as much as I do, or like other Battini concepts. They're more
Well,
probably
I
more.
want to get into this your project on the Injil certainly
Oh,
before we end
cool.
this
Yeah,
conversation.
we'll get into it towards the end, as like an outro.
Yeah.
But basically, I just wanted to say that I don't pretend like every time I think, oh, we should do another minha. Like I see a story about like Pakistan, like riots and so on, and it's like, how would I govern these people? Like if it was, just a thought experiment. And I'm like, well, I'd have to do a minha, I'd have to like be very harsh with them at some level. And there's a question of how harsh. And then I think, well, is that right? And this idea of like, okay, our madhab is, and that's what Quran only is. You might say it's a confederation of madhabs. It's a more, it's like the Mastodon server version of madhabs, right? Whereas Salafism is trying
I see it
to assert.
becoming a madhab eventually.
Yeah, I think if
Not
I think
yeah.
Schweib's fatwas are a little too harsh, and I think that Muhammad has a clean enough usul at a software level of the grammar, that he could potentially codify into a madhab. I don't think he's interested in doing that, but the point is that we all run an operating system, right?
Hmm.
So let's say that Mutazili, I like to think of as like is it's Linux. Well, which kind of Linux? It's like maybe it's Ubuntu, maybe with a perfection of the Dawa, which is kind of the thrust of this channel. Um, as more of a think tank level, a little early. That maybe it could be the Ubuntu of Linux type, reformy operating systems, whereas Sunniism is obviously Windows, right? And I don't know, maybe the Salafists are like XP maximalist. They're like, this is the version of Windows that's like the really good one. And then obviously the Shia would be like Mac OS, right? They're like really into like Steve Jobs and
Lovely.
right. So, so I don't think that everybody needs to run Linux, but there's like a lot of benefits to running Linux. And one of them is it's harder to get hacked. And another one is that they can't push updates on you, right?
Have you read Defenders of Reason by it's a triple author book. I sent a PDF
Was
of
that
it
the
in the
paper you
WhatsApp,
sent me?
but it was
I
a PDF of it's Defenders of Reason by Richard Martin Woodward and Atmaja. It's Mutazilism from medieval school to modern symbol. It's fascinating
honestly,
so
I
far.
haven't read
I'm
it,
just
and I've given up on reading and writing. Not
oh
entirely,
no.
but no, I haven't given up on like doing reading and writing in my life. But I mean, like, I've given up on the idea that I'm going to read everything myself and I'm going to write everything myself. So the latest AI has gotten. We could delve deeper on that. We'll come back to the
Sure.
book and the core
It makes
thrust here.
mistakes sometimes. I've caught it many times
No, for
in the
sure, and
historical like
it's slipped me
analysis of
Mickeys in
text.
code that have cost me hours to like. I had to go back to the version tree and figure out where it slipped me the Mickey, and then just undo it, right? But the latest version is significantly better, and in another 2 years, it's going to be. I'm not saying it's going to start a hard takeoff, but it is going to be significantly better.
Certainly getting
Um,
better.
and it's
But
at
one
the
to what you were saying with the
as I'm going to have it
Mutezilite thing.
scanning a lot because I have so many Bettini Shia things that I get from the group chat And I definitely disagree with them on a number of, of simple faith articles, but so yay, Metazolism relative to that. But and I have a number of I have things from you, and I have things from my work for the Injil book, and I have to like have the AI like crunch it, and then I'm gonna like go through and like actually read parts of these texts, and then I'm
Certainly
gonna have
helpful.
the AI. The AI is able to scan who are the Quranists and imitate my style, and so I don't have to rewrite it. I can do edits and and
Um,
like generate the book, and then probably what I'm going to do is edit it down so that it's like a more alchemically, pure chunk of
yeah,
my prose, right? Because
quote
there's some
from
I need to make money. I need to. There's a lot of things I need to do. So I like can't. I can't, handwrite it. So I'm admitting that publicly, and hopefully the result will be. It'll be difficult enough to tell that it
I'm
will be
looking forward to
interesting.
it.
Yeah. So we'll
Looking
talk more
forward to
about
it. So
that research and what that
yeah,
implies towards the end. So anyway, getting back to
I think
Muhammad Knight is this idea of like supremacy is bad, right? And the success of that though is like even though it's a false assertion, just like from a Godelian epistemological sense, right? You can't like come up with the right axioms of usul al-din to like build a Tower of Babel to God, like Pharaoh wanted to do, right? Um, and that's kind of what the Salafists have tried to do, and it's been very ugly. And then everybody has been irradiated by it. So Quranism is like post-Salafist reaction, Khomeiniism is like a Shia reaction, and the Sunni schools have been more like Mufti Abu Layth talks about how people didn't really talk about the Aisha age thing until the 20th century, or that Haimar
that's
wasn't
true.
even referred to hijab, and a lot of women like in Malaysia and so on, they like didn't wear it for like many centuries. If you read Ibn Battuta's life story, you had the women
Yeah,
in
I've read through some of his stuff. Yeah,
the women in the Maldives are going around topless, right? So this kind of earthy, flexible, ikhtilaf friendly ala sunnah, despite having elements of it that have these thorny exclusivisms, those were not, homogenized. And the internet and pre-internet modernity with the oil money really did a job on it. So in the diaspora, this is more true in the UK and in the US. It's bifurcated into just sort of generic, like we do zikr, we're Sufis, we don't believe in so much of this other stuff that the Salafi guys do. But at least the Salafis let you out of the masjid in a reasonable amount of time, right? Um,
yeah.
and there just aren't that many Muslims to delineate it. And of course, I think that something that's really kind of like just Muslim and the lessons about, what is the Quran saying about Jesus, alayhi salam? What does the Quran say about marriage and slavery and things like this? Kind of these basic questions that really drive people out of Islam or keep them from converting. Um, that I can have the software in a Madabi sense, and I can maybe use AI to help me speed that up, and formulate it. So I had it generate a latex, when they make the science papers with equations, and it's like in a neat little equation looking format. Um, and I'm analyzing the Quran in a modal set theory logic. So it's like really boiling it down and exposing different interpretations as like basically code. Um, I think this is really interesting. So then we can at the face of that, we can have like a marketing program for Islam. Like I was saying, like you're never going to get 100,000, which would only be like 5% of the Chilean. No, it would be like 0.5% of the Chilean population. You'll never get 100,000 Muslims in Chile without dawah, right? And I just don't think that the Salafi dawah, like I've seen people go through the Salafi dawah, um, and become like Salafi pilled, like this young guy that I know from the masjid. And he married a Christian girl because there's no Muslim girls to marry around here, basically. So that's going to be fun for him. We were talking about the exclusivism a
Many
little bit.
many
So
lay Salafis have very little to no engagement with traditional Islam. Like 90% of the time, they don't really understand madhabs. They don't understand uh, fiqh, like at all, really, or traditional Zulu fiqh. There's a complete ignorance, like a loss of traditional pedagogy. as far as like learning from a teacher, like traditional fiqh. Salafis don't do this really. They give them books by Ibn al-Wahhab and Ibn Taymiyyah and give them a copy of Bukhari and just go ahead, have at it. It's there's no teacher-student relations. There's complete loss of traditional tasawwuf where you have a sheikh. I think all of this is uh, contributes to this Salafism of modern Islam, especially at least in the West. I can speak to the West. I don't know much about Islamic majority countries, but I think they've been affected as well.
Well, according to
Um,
Muhammad, the Quran centric, like chill, back to the Quran type discourse, not necessarily like his particular harder Quran only discourse, is gaining quite a lot of cachet in the Middle East.
right,
So
probably
that
as a reaction to Salafism, because Salafi, Wahhabi uh, methodology gives this inflated sense of uh, Bukhari and Muslim, and it like I was in a class a couple weeks ago through mysteries school, and this guy's teaching Maliki fiqh, and they're asking about hadith and talking about how like 100 years ago, lay people did not read Bukhari and come to rulings on it ever. It was
yeah, there
unheard
was
of
no
100 years
shoot
ago.
from the hip Twitter fatwas being negated and
Never.
debated.
It was
Yeah.
completely unheard of.
And
Unheard
casual
of.
tack
Not
fear. Can you imagine? The
no.
Qadis used to be very cautious about tack fearing someone like me, for example,
Or
right?
have you ever
But
heard of the book Al Adab Al Mufrad? Have you ever
I
heard of
have
this?
not.
Al Adab Al Mufrad. It is a book that Bukhari wrote for everyday Muslims. No, I never heard of it. Why don't we hear about it? It's a book of much more stronger hadith that he intended for lay people to read and stuff. It's like the Imam Nawawi of Al Bukhari.
It's wild that
Why
I've
don't we
never
hear
even
about
heard of that
this?
actually, and I
Me
have a
neither. It's
bajillion
crazy.
Muslim things
Nobody
going
has
through
heard
my
about
head.
it.
Yeah. What's it
In
called
in
again?
American Islam, you never hear of this. It's Al Adab Al Mufrad. It's a book
Adab.
of like
Mufrad. What does
adab,
mufrad
pretty
mean?
much. I don't know the literal Mufrad translation, but it's just an example. It means a singular, uh, everyday living. I think Mufrad is like everyday
Ah,
living,
yeah,
kind of. Al Adab Al Mufrad, like everyday adab, kind of
makes
like
sense.
something like that. I'm kind of guessing,
So
but
Buhari was
this
kind
is
of
an
a chill
example
guy,
of
actually, is the plot twist.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that, and I haven't read through this, but the teacher I was learning from talked about how like lay people are not meant to. The books of hadith were not written for people to go get fatwas from. They were source or reference material for faqihs, for muftis to go and assess and come to their practical applications of legal rulings in a real juristic environment where these things were being applied in real situations, not in internet fatwas, right? And by real qadis. And like all this stuff has just become abstract, like theoretical, whereas like traditional Islam was applied in real situations with
Right. I
real
mean, you had to
communities, and it
make
wasn't all
minute
this like,
policy about everything.
right. Qadis didn't just open up Bukhari and be like, okay, well, we got to do this. They like is and this example of this book by Bukhari that is completely unknown to people. But like my wife, she's a convert. She was given a copy of Sahih Bukhari within becoming a Muslim within a couple of years, and it's like, what is she going to do with this? She doesn't know anything about Hadith, or like, it's just crazy. I feel like there's this just complete disconnect with traditional pedagogy, for lack of
Well,
a
to
better
be
word,
fair, this is
education.
precisely why they did not, other than that, the lithographic typeset, they didn't think it aesthetically appropriate to make little block typeset. But this is more or less why they did not adopt the printing press 400 years before they did,
They're
right?
worried about yeah the
Yeah.
the the Martin Luther
Everyone's going to
movement.
become
That's
a
cool.
Haruji with they're gonna realize that the Ottomans are corrupt or whatever, right? I mean, people didn't read the Quran either. I don't know if I mentioned this
No, they
on
didn't.
air. A
Muhammad
friend of
never
mine
talks about
married
that actually.
a Catholic woman from Poland. She grew up in a near Ukraine border town, and they were pulling radishes out of the snow and stuff. And so of course they go to Catholic church, right? And It was the Latin Mass. They still had the Latin Mass. And she'd never read the Bible until she was like in her 20s. And this is how everybody used
For
to live
Muslims,
in
right?
both
Like that.
Christendom and
Yeah.
the Islamic for most of history until 100
One of
odd years ago,
Knight's whole
50.
chapters, his whole chapter is about this. Like people's one of the later chapters, it talks about people's relationship to the Quran being a very liturgical relationship, right?
Right.
It's purely like, but it had an effect on them nonetheless. And I question the value of that. For me, I'm very much into the meat. If I don't know the meaning, I'm not getting the value, right?
Well, I'll tell you a little
And maybe I
quick story
go
about
on.
that. What really planted the seed for me to become a Muslim is I went out to Israel working for a Tel
Oh,
Aviv
I
based
recall this story.
company.
I think.
And
But
then
go on.
I've told this story, right? So, but to cut it to the quick, when the guy
Never
sang the
mind.
Quran to me at Maghrib time, I didn't know, I didn't even know it was Quran. Like he did not lay any dawah on me whatsoever, other than his adab and like having a Maghrib experience. And just, it was kind of he was a really great guy. It was like a magical experience for me. But I do believe that what he was doing wasn't just like, hey, by the way, this is the Quran. He didn't say, there's no context, even if there was. I think he was actually transmitting to me the ijazat of his Sisala back to Ali and alayhi salam and the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam, and kind of initiating me at a very minute level. I suspect this was like my confirmation, like when I was a Catholic confirmation, and the guy was about to die. The bishop put his thumbprint on my prana, and I got this jolt, and I just thought it was like psychosomatic because I'd been building it up in my head. But most Catholics don't experience that, and so I got like this one Rasul, because like the Catholics do have a Sicila as well, right? Even though obviously they're all over the place and they're corrupt and so on, but like um the energy current is there. So I believe that the Quranic recitation, and this is why tajweed isn't just random nonsense, although maybe it's overemphasized, is that you're actually transmitting an energy signature at a very precise frequency, and the
Right.
semantic content, the ayati of the Quran on how to be a just person and so on is also important, but there's this deeper esoteric level to it. Um, so I don't think I've expressed that on this channel yet, but I think it's an important detail.
Oh, it's an
Now,
interesting idea for sure.
on the other hand, what you're describing is the prime critique of Quranists about the Ummah, is that they don't really read and understand the Quran. Tafsir is made out to be this elite thing that you need like to get a college degree. And they did that to prevent this, Hawarij, kind of the same reason why they invented the Mahdi, to get the 12er Shia to quiet down, and they fabricated the
Also,
Musnad Zayd.
technological deficiency in mass printing and literacy. A lot of these, like, for instance, one of the foremost texts in the Maliki Madhab, the, let's see here, Madhab Rashid, it's a poem, right? It's a poem that is, if I can find it, Al-Murshid al-Mu'in by Ibn Ashir. It's a poem, like 500 lines, that explains the entire madhab, essentially. It explains Aqidah in the Ash'ari school, it explains fiqh, and then tasawwuf, all in 500 lines, everything a layperson needs. And it was poetry because he said, I wrote this for the benefit of the illiterate, essentially, like people who can't read and write, which is a lot of people back then. So he made them a nice poem that condenses all these
Is that
Islamic concepts
Bida
that you couldn't.
technically?
Bid'ah?
I mean,
I
think
don't think
about it.
anybody. What's that?
Nobody considered it Bida back
I
then,
mean,
but in a Salafi sense, that's Bida.
no, of course not. And Salafi might consider it bid'ah. I don't know, but then you'd have to say like any fiqh text is bid'ah. It's a
Well,
mnemonic kind of
and
aid,
that's
but
kind of their.
poetry is not.
No, but the point is, like,
Maybe I don't know.
here's
It
a
depends on the
religious text
Salafi
that I,
for sure.
some guy down the centuries have fabricated to help guide you, because I don't think you can handle the Quran or whatever, right? So I mean, that is
No, it was more like
Salafism, is
to
they're
They're just in
reconstructing ijma of the Salaf
mnemonic aid.
because they believe that fiqh is at some level bidah. Yet they pray on prayer mats, they go to masjids with minarets, they might contest the Muhammad calligraphy next to the Allah calligraphy, which Quranists also contest, and I don't love either. But like the minarets are bidah, like a lot of things are bidah, right? Like just it's like and the Shia have the
I guess
little
there's a lot of things about the.
the Shia have the turba because of course the Prophet didn't they didn't have like a prayer mat industry back then in Medina. Everything was a little bit chaotic. It was not a
Even
long
in the
time.
uh, Maliki text I'm reading on, like uh, praying on an ornate carpet is disliked.
Oh
Like
really? And everybody does it,
everyone
including
does it, and even
including
nobody.
Salafis.
Yeah, yeah, of course, and that was disliked in the Maliki, according to one Maliki.
Well, I'll be honest. I have
Reputable
tried
was
because of the Shia
dislike.
thing. I'm like, okay, praying on a clay cookie is also bidah, so I don't buy that. It's like it was a kiosk, and they're
A
supposed to
bid'ah
be
is like
anti-kiosk because of the Jafari thing. But then again, it's like, come on, like that's kiosk. So you guys are guilty of bida and kiosk that you claim to be above from these Jafari hadiths. But I have prayed on the ground, and I don't love it because obviously you get doity. So
yeah,
I do
I
prefer
work
to.
outside and it's not nice. Getting pine needles and dirt all over my face.
Right, it depends on where you're praying. Yeah, so if you get a relatively sparse area, you get minimal dust on it. But there's an Ali hadith that says these people are like, "Oh, we're your Shia," and he's like, "If you were my Shia, then you would have dust on your forehead and be humble and so on, right?"
Yeah,
And this is
I think
why,
this was retained in the Maliki madhab to some extent,
well, there's a
insofar
lot of
as it
very
has some
interesting.
connections with Jafari
This would be a
faction.
really good document to generate with a GPT 4.5 request because it's really good at pulling all these things together. Is like which hadiths are in the Sunni corpus attributed in some isnad that are attributed to Shia imams. So the Bid'ah hadith
Not a
is
lot,
one of them.
really.
There are quite a number of them, and it's weird how many there are, and it makes you really wonder about these.
Or wait, how many in the Sunni collections are attributed to Shia imams?
Like the overlap in that they have different isnads. I'm not sure how many
Oh, I see, I
gross,
see, I
but
see.
I'm saying the ones that do overlap are like really fundamental
This would be
hadiths, like the
interesting.
Bida one and
You
some
mean
other
you
ones.
mean hadith found in Sunni collections that have a parallel matan but different isnad in the Shia collections?
Right. And the point
Like
is
the
that
Sunnis
both
like
of the isnats
took
can't be
a
true
Imami hadith
because
and changed it.
because the
Yeah.
Shia version is like our, specific imams, Muhammad al-Bakr or whoever it was, alayhi salam, I guess,
It is
said
really
so.
interesting. You'd think I've talked with my local imam about this. Like I pressed him why Bukhari didn't go talk to some Ahl Bayt who were alive during his time. Like you think that'd be the logical thing to do if you're
Well, they
being a
were
thorough
mass
hadith
exterminated
collector,
by the
right?
Abbasids, so it
Right.
was hard to find
Yeah.
them. And
Right.
also, it was he hated
No,
like
but
they're all sort of semi-Nasibi as well, right? Like, not to become too Shia partisan here, but yeah, the only Salaf that I'm really interested in are Salman al-Farsi, Abu Dar, Ibn Masud, and Ali, alayhi salam. And
the
that's
whole
it.
concept of a salaf, a group of like particular individuals, and what is the salaf? And salaf can mean, in the broadest sense, anybody who came before you. Really, I
Well,
mean,
actually, technically, they're
it doesn't
Sahabi, they're
have to
not
be.
Salaf. So the Salaf, right? No, that's also a broader point. But well, and the Quran uses the term exclusively negatively, right? Like my favorite line in Surah Kaf, and there's a lot of good chestnuts in Surah Kaf, right? That's why it's so popular, and the Sufis love it. There's an interesting topology. That's another little PDF to spit out that I had generated the other day. But that nothing will deter you. Huzabillah shaitan rajim. Nothing, paraphrasing, not a hafiz. Nothing will deter you once guidance has come to you, except for the insistence to follow the way of the salafin, of your predecessors, right? Something like this. So
Oh yeah, is this? Which one is it?
it's like it's in the middle of it. It's like 50 something, I think, possibly.
Paraphrase it again.
Nothing. It's after the story of the two guys, the rich guy and the poor, like rich dad, poor dad, like rich hellbound dad, humble, Jannah bound poor dad. And then after that story, it talks about, and then there was the Adam thing, and then there's going to be Judgment Day, and then it says, and
How did you paraphrase it though? Nothing
nothing
will.
will deter you from paradise or success once guidance has come to you, except for following the ways of the Salaf, basically. So.
the people
It's
who preceded you.
it's like a pretty yeah, it's like a pretty sharp indictment of Sunni traditionalism and Salafism, in
What if
my
a guy
biased
has
reading.
come? What surah is it?
Yeah, Surah Kaf.
Your calf. Calf. I want to find it actually. Let's see. I have 55. It looks like. Let's see here.
So anyway, just saying that on a technical note, I guess the only Salafs that I'm interested in would be Hussein and Hassan alayhi salam. Um, and maybe I guess Abu Hashim, who is the grandson of Ali from the Al Hanafiya clan. So what's interesting about that is that is not that Ali got remarried after Lady Fatima alayhi salam died. You know, that's sort of, I mean, I would do the same thing. You know, I like women. Ali liked women. Women liked him. But the point is that this was a woman from a clan in the Najd, and this was the clan that had refused to pay their zakat to Abu Bakr, not because they had apostated from belief in the Quran, but because their ijtihad, their interpretation, was that this is for, you know, the poor. And in the Najd, they were like relatively poor compared to in the Hijaz, right? There's no coastal trade
I
routes.
found the ayah.
They're all Bedouins, basically.
Ayah. The ayah
Okay.
said, and nothing prevents men that they have faith when guidance comes to them, and that they ask for forgiveness of their Lord, except that comes to them the Sunnatul Awwalin, the Sunnah of the former people, or comes to them the punishment before that. Yes. Yeah, so it's referring, nothing comes to people don't, nothing prevents people to have faith or that they ask forgiveness of God, except that the practice of the former people, like what God talks about, all the communities that were warned and destroyed come to them, or the punishment comes face to face to them. Right? So it's more.
Yeah.
I think it's more general. And it's like
Yeah, you could
I
twist it.
wouldn't say it's an indictment of Sunni,
Well,
Sunni Islam.
I appreciate you moderating my bias.
Yeah,
But yeah,
I'm not trying
but you
to.
definitely you could assert it, and then they could say no, but that doesn't. I mean, that's always how these conversations go. I asked a guy, where's the proof in the Quran that, you know, there's Islam, the infallibility, and he
Isma.
was like,
Oh,
and
Isma
he
of the
accused me of
prophets
being
or the Imams.
childish for wanting a proof text, and then he said that if there was a proof text against it, it would paradoxically prove it. So I was really confused about that. I was like, what kind of shirk is this? You know, and I just stopped
The
engaging with
Isma
him.
of the prophets or the Imams.
Well, for the Shia, it's also the Imams, but for Sunnis, it's the Prophets, and then the
This is
Sahabi
something.
are considered generally trustworthy, albeit factually not perfect, right? But they sort of
Yeah, that
don't
one's a
talk
weird
about that.
one. Masnoon, I think, in this Masnoon and the recent Akita thing I was looking into. That's stumbled me to like infallibility, quote unquote. But
So I
I
asked
think
ChatGPT.
from their perspective, oh, go on.
No, please. I want to hear what you have to say before I tell
I
you
was,
what AI had to say.
I was just saying that I was taking a recent class because I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to give traditionalism, traditional Sunni Islam, the benefit of the doubt. I don't feel like I really ever gave it
Yeah,
before uh,
maybe
following
to
like,
deprogram yourself from the Quranism fervor.
yeah, and maybe I'll come out better on the other side of it. I'm trying to give it a benefit of doubt and engage with it honestly. And
Well, mashallah.
even though I find I'm not 100% on board with it by any means.
Yeah, well, it's
But
immoral and false.
I'm exploring the value of a normative authority in the form of like scholarly tradition. But they said in the recent Akita, because I'm trying to understand Akita, although I'm getting less and less interested the more I delve into it. And this goes into our Mutazilite theme. Um, the Masnoon of the Prophet, like infallibility, quote unquote, was caveated by it's just anything, they wouldn't do anything that tarnishes their character. And the reason they say this is that if God were to send somebody with like faulty character to lead community, it would be like a fault on God. So they were explaining like God wouldn't send somebody who could do something so bad that it tarnishes their reliability as a person or their good character, or else that would reflect badly on God. That's their rationale.
But that's like a pretty
I
big
haven't totally figured it out.
leap of faith,
What's that?
to assume that. because
assume that
there's no textual support for it.
right. Yeah. Well, Akida doesn't often isn't textual. They use kalam, right? They use like logical and syllogisms and stuff throughout, or at least most of this class was all syllogisms. It wasn't really textually based because
So
Akida
what?
is all about them engaging with the all these like philosophers and stuff, right? So a lot of the proofs are mainly logical proofs.
Well, you know why it's called kalam? It's not because they were conversing with words. It's because they were questioning. Okay, we believe in one God. We don't believe that there are necessary, co-deities, and yet they run into this philosophical conundrum of the one and the many. And in the case of Islam with the Quran in particular, this involves the question of like God's word. So the
Yeah,
mutakalimun
yeah, right.
were those who separate like mutanika is like we're gonna hook up and then we're gonna separate after a term, or
Sure.
mutasadikat are those who are generous. They cut off a piece of their truth in this factual material good that they're
Mm-hmm.
giving away. So mutakalimun are those who separate God's word from God. And so
Yeah.
the Mutazili do that by just saying, it's created, so mystery solved. And then the Asheris are like, no, but it can't be just that simple, and so on, right?
Yeah, and I got it. I'm definitely on the Mutazilite side of things in this argument. Although I haven't looked into the details, it just seems absurd to me. Say the Quran is uncreated, and then they create these weird loopholes, like, well, the
Oh, great, it's not corrupted. It didn't work.
how's my audio?
Oh, it's all good, man. Yeah, a little technical difficulty there, but save the file.
Sorry.
I'm gonna maybe edit out that chunk where we're out of power. So, anyways, so go on. Tell me what we were talking about Mutakalimun
I
and
guess
just
I don't know where I got cut off. I think I was rambling for a little bit after it got
well, yeah, because we
disconnected.
were
But I was
spiraling out
asking
into
how
Akida in general, and it's a sub
right the
example of
Mutazilite stuff.
inference of systematic quote unquote knowledge from the scriptural foundation and how those can be wildly disparate. And the point I
I was
was going to
wondering about
make,
your
what were you wondering about?
or what I was rambling about before it got disconnected was or one moment. Yes. All right, thank you. Um the your neo-Mu'tazilite view or relation to Aqidah, or not Aqidah, to fiqh.
Mm.
Because as I understand it, Mu'tazilite, they weren't a fiqh group. They were strictly like theology, although the early Mu'tazilites had fiqh, but they were in that proto-Sunni soup that hadn't yet congealed into distinct groups yet, really, as
That's
far
a
as I
great
understand
question,
it.
man. Yeah, they were early Hanafis, which is very different from modern Hanafis.
Right? Like the
To the
proto-Hanafis,
extent
yeah. Right.
that it's almost worth kind of rebuilding usul al fiqh, like what are our axioms systematically from which to derive fatwa, inshallah, and maybe do a better job of even if our fatwas are incorrect and maybe encouraging people to sin or being too lax would be probably the crime that Mutasili would tend to be guilty of in fiqh, but at least we're like raising the bar on transparency about how we derive rulings, right?
There does need to be, in this day and age of complexity and different views, there does need to be an Azul. And this is kind of why I'm leaning on tradition a little bit, even though I'm not like. And honestly, I gotta give credit to Mufti Abu Layth. He's honestly one of my heroes, and
He's done a lot
the way he
for
engages,
fiqh. He's made fiqh seem
the way he
cool.
engages with the tradition, yeah, and he's
Yeah,
honest about it,
I
and
wouldn't
he's
even
super
believe in
knowledgeable.
Sunnah if it wasn't for him. This is the weird thing. I wouldn't believe in
He's a
Ali if it wasn't for Mufti Abu Layth as a stepping stone,
right.
probably. I mean, I can't really speak counterfactually, but
I don't even agree with everything that Mufti Abu Layth. I don't believe in his interpretation of miracles necessarily.
no, neither.
Um, no, no,
And he's
but
too lax
I
about weed.
respect that man. Yeah, a little bit. He
Like,
probably was never really
weed's
smoked that
bad,
much, is
kids.
why. I think that's I don't think he ever experienced it. Like myself, I grew up as like I was a stoner in my late teens and stuff, but I
Right.
don't think he's ever experienced some of the more negative
You
aspects
can
side of it.
really waste a
Um,
lot of your life on weed, and that is not,
Absolutely, 100%.
when you have a finite amount of time to
Yeah.
do deeds before Judgment Day, that is not cool. Now,
I grew up in Northern California. I was grew up in Dreadneck country, right? That was
Dreadneck.
everything for that was my that was my culture growing up.
Mm,
Um,
mashallah.
but Mufti Abu Layth, him and some of the scholars that I really admire in the Shadhili Tariqa, particularly, oh, only one particularly, Ibn Atallah. He's a Maliki Qadi and Mufti back in the day, and his writings just touch me in a way that I just can't. Similar to like Al Ghazali, I don't even agree with Al Ghazali a lot, but when you read his works, something about it just it really touches your heart. And Mufti Abu Layth and Ibn Atallah, these Maliki figures, really convinced me that the Maliki framework is a framework I can work within in this journey, in this particular part of my journey. And
Yeah,
yeah, I'm excited
I
to,
like it.
and I think it helps me engage with my community in a much more meaningful way. Like,
Are they Maliki?
uh, no, the this American Islamic community has no madhab. They're
Right.
pseudo Salafi, kind of like culturally Hanafi, but Salafi in practice and stuff, and like
Well, I'll
so
note
they're
that
culturally right.
the only reason why I've really come in contact with any Madhabi Sunnis is because there's a South African Shafi contingent as well as Indian merchant descendants who tend to be Hanafi, and they've been displaced by like a century or maybe half a century, so they're not as warped by the weird sub sectarianism of Indian subcon of Desi Hanafism with like the Deobandis and the Barelvis and so on. And they send a bunch of hafids over during Ramadan. So I was praying with them in Ramadan, and it's like, I have all this antipathy about problems with Al Sunnah, but I'm just like really grateful that there's like we're even here doing Laylatul Qadr with like five. There was one young Chilean woman who was a recent convert, and it was her first time at a masjid, and she had a loose fitting hijab on, like her hair was still falling out of it, and they let her pray with us. They didn't, they did the right thing, right? They weren't gonna. What are they gonna?
Fantastic.
put her out on. Oh no, it's a fit. No, come on, guys. And then the two Hanafi bros were like smoking cigarettes after. I'm like, maybe this is bad. I'm like exposing their sin, or is it a sin? This is one of
Sure,
those
sure.
in the Hanafi madhab. It's not a sin, right? That's another Salafist radiation bit there. But cool, whatever. Smoke your cigarettes, whatever, man. Like, even if it is a minor sin. I'm just grateful that we're here just doing anything, because faith is
Right.
not that common, like,
Right. Exactly. And Islam is a social religion. This is another thing why I kind of got off the online Quran alone community, which I was so engrossed in for years, is
hmm
that I just want to, I'm chilling with my community here. You know, we're, how do I say it? And maybe this has something to do with having children too. Like I don't want my children to think I'm the only Muslim in the world, let alone all other
right.
Muslims are wrong. And this is not a, a, a utilitarian. I'm not doing it. Oh, because I have kids, I have to be dishonest with myself. It's not because I'm being dishonest with myself. It's a it's a true value in being community, and I don't fear everyone. I love the Muslim tradition in all its shapes and colors. I love to learn about Shia. I love to learn about Sunni, this Tasawwuf, and some Salafi scholars have great points.
Do you have any
Yusuf
Shia in your
al-Qaradawi.
tri-state
We
in
have
your area?
we have a really we have an interesting brother who recently converted who is Iraqi but grew up in America. He was adopted as a teenager. He joined the American military even as a
Hmm.
teenager and like didn't grow up with Islamic roots but had Shia roots. He didn't grow up religious in Iraq. But we hang out now and he's married to a convert and he's kind of Shia. He's Shia in for sure, but he's part of our community, right? So it's not
Right,
really
because how many
there's
masjids
no
are there anyway? Yeah.
there might be one like an hour north, closer to Seattle, maybe, but nowhere near us with conveniently. Um, but no, he's super chill. That's the thing. And I've known other Shia in California that went back and forth between the masjid sometimes, and it wasn't a big deal. This is
Well,
the thing when we start calling other Muslims like anybody who believes in God and the Quran is a Muslim, and maybe even more than that. I'm fine considering other people Muslims too,
yeah,
to an extent, Sunnis
like
and
Finkelstein.
uh, Finkelstein. Yeah, maybe
I
so.
mean,
Yeah, for
he's a
sure.
Jew. He's like
That's a
definitely a Jew, but he's like a Muslim with a little M.
yeah. He might be an atheist though. I don't know. Does
Oh well, then
Finkelstein believe
maybe
in
not.
God?
Oh,
I'm
then
not
he's
sure.
kafir.
I'm not sure. You got to believe in God.
I mean,
That's
yeah, we're not asking for a whole lot here.
no. That's the Freemasons ask for it even.
Yeah, sure,
Uh,
exactly, and they're a bunch of
yeah.
upstanding citizens, aren't they?
Yeah.
Um,
Right. No, but
they
this sectarianism infects not just Sunnis and Shia. It's in the Quran alone community too. It's
yes,
I think the root. And maybe you recall that the essay I wrote last year about sectarianism within the believers and like how animosity is one of the biggest indicators of sectarianism. When you start to feel animosity towards other people and the superiority complex, that's sectarianism, and it comes in all
right.
shapes and colors.
No, it's been a great exercise for
I don't know
me
how
to
I
not
don't know
well
how I rambled about how I
this
got
no,
into
but
that.
it's a good
Sorry.
point. It's a really important point, and that's why I wrote "Who Are the Chronists" as well, was to try to like help
It's a
people to
great book.
not.
It's a great book.
Thank you. The best
I want to
compliment I
see a second edition.
yeah well yeah maybe the best compliment I got was from a young, I assume a young American convert, just from his vernacular on the sub, and he said the clarity was insane, which is like a very Zoomer vernacular, right? Like because it's like antonymical, right? Like
It
insanity and
was when you
clarity.
posted it on
It's like
Kaniyun.
it's like if like, oh man, that was a bad book, and I'm like, thank you very much. That really means a lot.
Oh, nice. Right.
Like in the '90s, I was like, oh, that's bad, like it means good. So like
Yeah,
the
yeah.
clarity was very sane. Actually, it helped sanitize me. Like was I think what he meant by that. Like he was
No, it was
so flustered by all of the noise and the shaitan and the oh no, this is the truth claim and you're wrong and so on, that it was like doing voodoo for his brain to read something that was like they believe this because of this and they believe this because of this and this is how reading can differ and it's part of the challenge. Wittgenstein talked about it,
you shared it
and like
as a you shared it as a post on Kron, right?
yeah, when I published it,
Yeah. I remember. I think I read it like immediately that day, and I read it like all within one day. Actually, I was very
like
excited
Harry
about it.
Potter.
Yeah, exactly. It was
Well, I appreciate that means a lot
really
to
well
me, man.
done.
Because I did put in a lot of
Yeah,
effort, and I basically took like a month off of work to write it, and like that was not cheap to do.
yeah.
So this is why I'm gonna use the AI to help me generate the next one. But the research I've done is quite good. But before we get into that, I want to jump back to the early point when I was talking to the guy about Isman, and then he made this sort of it would be paradox if there was a textual claim against it, it would paradoxically prove it. And I'm like, what? So I asked the AI about this, and the AI was like, well, they came up with this, the Sunni scholars, in order to reinforce belief in the Quran, because if it's a fallible guy who brought it to you, then why believe it? And so actually, like brother Muhammad from God, I guess we're all from God at the creation level, but I think he's quite correct when he gets into these things with these guys, and they have this epistemic, you know, what are the ground rules, and even like with Muhammad Hijab when he jumped on his stream, and of course it quickly got derailed into pure shenanigans and like like this monkey business. And well, I'm justified to do that because he's kafir, this kind of stuff. But anyway, it all comes down to, what is your reason to believe? And for people who had less faith, the reason had to be that like we are authoritative people who have come from even more authoritative people who came from even more authoritative people who are like sinless, like they're like superheroes. And you go, wow, that's like super social. That's like a social proof recursion that
I
leads
love
back to God.
Muhammad. I
Whereas
love
what
Muhammad Knight's analogy between the Ibn Hanbal action figure. That's what makes me think of your. He does this like trope throughout the book. I don't know how long ago you read it,
well,
but
yeah, we need to get more of
it
this
was
book
really
into
funny.
this chat. So tell me, this sounds like a lot of fun.
He's he has this joke that's going on about like I'm trying to recall it, but like there's there's this Ibn Hanbali action figure, and like whether he like you break it open and play with it and like do like scenes like GI Joes and stuff, or you keep him in its box pristine and like don't touch him, or like I wish I could find some excerpts, but Muhammad Knight is an incredible writer. He's very
Yeah, he's a lot
clever,
of
and
fun.
he's a
Yeah,
reader's writer too. I feel like he writes for readers, and it's
yeah,
very
he's rare among
American
academics
in
for
one
that.
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's but in a really like I don't know, something about it echoes like just like
So I
it's
get the
very
people
much an
who keep
American book.
I get the people who keep the Ibn Hanbal action figure in the box, and they're like it's a collector's item. Who are the people who play
Yeah,
with the Ibn Hanbal
I
action?
I think that's him. I think he's.
Oh, okay.
I wish I could find it. Let me see. I'm flipping through it right now. I got
Well,
my
and that's one thing
copy.
I notice about Salafists, like on Islam QA, is they talk about Sheikhul Islam and our leader Ibn Hanbal. And I'm like, wait, what? Like, it's just
Wild.
so culty. It just comes off like, if you have like any sense of like of 1 foot in reality, like these things are all red flags, like because they betray an epistemology based on social proof, which is monkey business. Like, if you know anything about investing, especially investing in illiquid assets like startup equity, social proof, or even like meme coins and stupid crap like that, that's more liquid, but that's to its detriment, right? To the the people who buy it's detriment. um, they are so driven by social proof, and the correlation is very negative. Actually, right? Like a lot of people passed on Airbnb, for example, and many other hit stories because they were like, "Oh, the fundamentals don't pencil out for us." But then, if like Mark Suster invested in it, then you're gonna. I don't know if he did invest in it, but like then you'll invest in it, right? So it's just like you get so much data that social proof is like it's not negatively correlated. It's just a low correlation to actual success, right? That it just seems very primitive, that this would be the basis of
Yeah,
it. Whereas, like for me and for you, and what Brother Mo teaches on his YouTube channel is like we believe in the Quran because its content struck us as both profound. It's also a very emotionally emphatic book, which can leave, unless you reject it, it leaves quite an impression on
this is
you.
the reason for faith in the Quran, right?
Like there's a lot
This
of
is
health.
I
You can feel the heat of hellfire
yeah,
reading the Quran, and you can also feel the cool breeze of paradise. Like so, there's a very and it's very primitive. So I think this is both a feature and a bug of the Quran. This is why I don't believe in Quran only. Is that it's much easier to get into monotheism reading the Gospel of Mark or the Didache than to read the Quran, right? Like if you read the Quran after you've been praying for a little while, it's still going to
mm,
maybe be a little intimidating, but you can maybe
it's
get
very
through it
intimidating.
and
Yeah,
digest it. And it's only once you've gotten used to the heat. It's like the Varia suit in Super Metroid. You go into Norfair and it's like you're losing HP every
that's crazy.
second. Only millennials will appreciate this. Well, actually, no, because there's been more recent Metroid games with the Varia suit. So you have to
So
put on the Varia suit to really get value out of the Quran, to get the speed booster, to get the screw jump, and so on, right? And be able to start penetrating in the esoteric things that I don't even think Brother Mo has penetrated all of those. Like he doesn't buy into the Ruhudus being other than Jabril, for example. So that's like the
oh
door
yeah, that's
to
interesting.
my Batiniism. Um,
Mm.
what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I've never seen the Ruhul Qudus as Gabriel. That doesn't seem Abrahamically coherent,
It
really.
doesn't jump out at you, does it? But that's because we
No,
read the
no.
Bible first.
Right. I think that's a big part of it. When you're
Yeah,
grounded in that, it's a bit different. But do we have time to get into your Injil thing? Because
we
or
do.
where you're at on that project? Because before you go, I want to bring up I had two Christians over at my home yesterday. One was a coworker, and one was my coworker's Christian friend within his community. And we must talk for 3 hours, and it was a fantastic conversation. They were a little bit younger on the evangelist side, but they brought up the Islamic dilemma, that whole thing, which
Yeah.
honestly I never really gave too much thought to. I intuitively responded, and when I reviewed Khalil Amdani's response
Okay.
to it. He pretty much mirrored my intuitive response. Um, and there's also a big problem with how people translate Al Kitab. This is something I've been tripping on for years. Um, mistranslation of Al Kitab as previous scriptures, or sometimes it's the Quran, sometimes it's the Torah. People mistranslate it all the
Well,
time.
actually,
But
this is another gripe that I have with God, astaghfirullah, but it is what it is, about the Quran. And it's like, God leaned in the way God did with this. But is that, the word you sometimes means the prophet, it sometimes means you, the reader, throughout time. And kitab is another one of those sort of dangling participles that have tremendous significance in how you interpret it. And this is even deeper than like, is this verse mubin or mutashabihat, like we were talking about at the top of this, right? So yeah, I think that the kitab as like all of reality, including like physics and science and Platonic eternals and so on, which is like the Ishmaeli teaching. This is something that I agree with the Ishmaelis on, even though I'm not a Neoplatonist. Um,
I agree with something very similar about the Kitab. What is the Kitab?
but but
Absolutely.
but sometimes it also does mean the Quran, right?
No, it
Um,
never does. I don't believe it does.
oh,
I
never.
don't
You
believe it
think it
does.
never means the
Ever.
Quran?
It never does. No. Because God
But what about like the beginning
distinguishes
of
between
Surah
it so
Kaf? It's like
explicitly.
Alhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen. He sent down the kitab, and
So
that's not
forth.
referring to itself.
No, I don't think the Quran ever refers to itself as Al Kitab.
It does also
I
refer to
think
itself as the Quran, like at the beginning of
it
Yasin
is
and the
the
beginning
Quran.
of Rahman. Well, I mean, it is,
It is the Quran.
but also that, hold on, Donnie's correct, that
Because
the Hebrew translation of what they would refer to as reading the Torah, it would be Quran also. Like they're just, they're, they get
God
the cube
says
and they start doing the autistic
the thing.
self-soothing thing. And, I saw the
Uh,
Hafiz guys doing that. I do it when I do zikr. It
Sometimes it
actually
helps.
makes it much more pleasurable.
Sometimes it helps. Yeah.
So
The
okay, so
Quran,
so you're intuitive, but
God says
let's
the
dive.
Quran is the tafsir of al-Kitab. God says
Interesting.
this
Yeah. No, I
Quran
think there's
is the
something to
tafsir
that.
al-Kitab.
Yeah, and the
The
Quran.
Quran
This is almost
is
like
an
the Ashari
explanation.
Kalam al Nafsi idea. Is that a Quran is like a phenomenological sub-instancing of this like class of like truth,
Right.
which the kitab represents. Yeah. Well, I feel like
I
we're coming
think
up
the
on two
Kitab.
hours. I'm going to edit this down, so we
Oh
technically
shoot!
have about
Wow.
15 minutes or ish.
I don't know if we have
Um,
time to get into your Injil, but if you could just update us on
I
the
mean, or we could just
projects
go on
itself,
beyond
that
2
would be.
hours, but I feel like people are getting bored. So let's no, but
I
like
actually do got to do some chores, so
we'll
yeah.
get into the to what I'm doing, and then people will eventually will read the book, and it won't be too long because I'm going to
Yeah.
stop
Well, I'm
procrastinating,
curious.
and I'm
Maybe
going to
I'll
use
get
the
it
and I'll
myself.
touch on a few of the research points beforehand, but to lead into that, I'm really interested about how you answered your Christian friends about the so-called Islamic dilemma.
Yeah, I they brought up a 548 initially,
Yes,
which goes on about judged by um that one was easier. That whole passage I pretty much framed as, oh, this is like God instructing Muhammad on how to deal with Christians and Jews in his community. This is my understanding
like
of
you're
it.
not
Like,
going to
tell
hell for
them to
having a
judge.
glass of wine with dinner. Don't worry. Like that's what
No,
that
but
means.
also like it's an explicit instruction. It's like a governing thing. It's like Muhammad is being told to judge by what God has revealed to him, to let like tell the people the gospel and Torah to judge by what's in their books, right? It's kind of like a political thing. Like Muhammad's going to like manage these communities, so God is telling him to do that. And that I was comfortable with that. But the next one they brought up about a dozen verses later in 68, I had a harder time explaining because it's a different context. And it says, say it's a 568. It says, say, uh, yeah, Ahlul Kitab, you are not on anything until you uphold the Torah and Injil and what has been revealed to you by your Lord. And surely what has been revealed to you increases many of them in rebellion and disbelief to your Lord, so do not grieve over the disbelieving people.
So
This
this
verse is
generally
harder to
seems to be
explain.
referring to the Quran.
This
The
verse is referring to and what has been revealed to you by your Lord. Yeah, the
yeah,
and at the end. But then what
like
is
I
God
accept that
referring
the first
to?
part means the text you have, even if they have tarif, it's still good enough, and you're sort of in that social contract. So you even if you're not up completely on hawk, you're being judged vis-a-vis your own good faith performance to what you've signed on to. So I'm
Yeah,
and this is where the polemicists go benoodles. But then with the
yeah.
exclusivists who do the opposite of this, like Shadi al-Mazri and many Sunni Orthodox
I
scholars,
disagree with this completely. Yeah.
they do the opposite of the Sam Shamoon, uncharitable reading. Um, and with the second part, and they lay on the past perfect, which is very common in the Quran because it's sort of from God's perspective, looking back on all of time, and it's all compressed into like a hologram. So this is like the prophetic past perfect tense, and right, but um, the so that's the argument, and of course we reject that argument, right? Because we believe that to be a
Yeah,
Muslim is an inner
100%.
state. It doesn't have to do with saying in Shahada. Even though I presume you say
A
Tahashud in
caveat,
your
I
Salah.
do think once somebody gets exposed enough, there is an obligation, right? Once you,
You get pulled
but
in to
if
the
you don't have the
gravity.
knowledge, yeah,
But
there's a
also, there's so
level of
many Muslims
accountability,
that are like deeply misled and so on, right?
right? It's
So
something
it's like
God's in charge of, right?
so there's a fractal of like truthiness to one's
Right.
and like so. For instance, I believe that this past Ramadan, I was initiated into yet another rank promotion, and I've been digesting that. That's why I haven't made a video in the last month. Is that I've been like contesting with a very tremendous fate that has been put upon me. And that before that, I was initiated to the level of like basically a sheikh, which sounds very presumptuous. And also, what's the next level? That sounds even more presumptuous. And I was initiated into the level of a murid. And I was already, as a Christian, when I came back to Christianity, on the level of like a metaphorical believer, which is like level two, right? I was thinking about making a video about this, just a short one about ranks. It might be interesting for people, esoterica. Be careful what you wish for, folks, because you make these Laytul Qadr du'as and you go out and you see the red moon at 2 in the morning, and then you don't get to be the same normie person anymore. So anyways, before I spiral too much, I believe that I've been guided to some serious stuff, and I believe that
Finding
I'm going to
Injil.
be held at a high standard. And so whereas a girl who like fell in love with a guy and then he like kidnapped his children from his exes who divorced him because he was like one of these, angels curse you until morning type guys. And he's like fighting for ISIS in Syria and he's like stolen his children. And she's on Reddit saying that she renounces Islam. I don't think she's even been exposed to guidance at the level that that one verse
For sure.
cursing apostates to hell would apply to her, because like how is like the opposite of guidance that you've been exposed to, right? So maybe it's guidance to help you detox from that mushrik thing. And same thing with like
Whereas
outage.
I've
Yeah.
heard Shadia al-Masri, and I respect him a lot, but I disagree with him in this instance. He says, "Oh, if you've heard that there's a prophet in Arabia, you have the obligation to go learn everything about him." But that's not realistic for most people. I
Well,
grew
and
up
when
in
it's
rural
represented,
America.
when everybody is, saying, well, you're a kafir if you don't believe that pedophilia can be good sometimes. This is another layer of
Sometimes,
veiling, and there are many. That's just one of many. There's the terrorism and so on, the
right?
whole history and the corruption of it. Um,
Everything. It's everything.
Whereas if everybody were like, I think, proper Shia in this low imamology Mutazili sense, without shirk, without Walayat al-Faqih, without even necessarily the Jafari stuff that's so challenging and loopy,
Yeah,
but
we didn't
just
even
like,
get into Zaydism, but maybe next time.
well,
So,
yeah, maybe. But my version of that's even less than Zaydism with all this, I think, fabricated fiqh that was social engineering to keep these people primitive in Yemen, is that, and to keep them quietist ultimately, because you get the same Umayyad stuff that gets inserted there, is that from a Mutazili Shiism point of view, your minimum viable Shiism is to appreciate that Ali had with him in his Zulkifar sword a scroll containing the Constitution of Medina, and he pulled it out and he read it to his men to justify why they should not begin executing the Shiatul Aisha, as well as obviously Aisha, who may
yeah,
have repented
Delish.
later in life
Yeah,
before Muawiyah had her poisoned. So she may go to Jannah. Like, I'm not going to curse Aisha, right? It would be very presumptuous of me, and it would go against Ali's wishes because Ali wanted her to have the chance to repent, because Rasulullah had left that, because the Quran and the Constitution of Medina were equally, I would, or if not equally, the Constitution of Medina was an important supplement, um, governing Medina. You know, um,
was.
and then obviously his sirah, the way that he was gracious with the Hawarij who betrayed him, and that he tried to play the long game and he didn't just have everybody dying in a direct confrontation with Muawiyah, and everything before that, the way all the companions kind of sidelined him, and he stayed true to the spiritual message. These are very important things, and that this is like a very Quran centric appreciation of Shiism. So I think if Islam was like this, then you wouldn't have this pedophilia crap. You wouldn't have the terrorism. The empires would have behaved more like the Fatimid Empire. There wouldn't be so many examples of egregious war crimes and so on that the Christian polemicists love to cite. And of course, they're also guilty of this in their empires and so on. But
The
no,
political
and
history
this
of
is
the
why
whole
the
thing.
libs, the secular atheist feminists, who are just like, this is all patriarchal nonsense. Like, I don't blame them. Maybe God will blame them, but I don't blame them, because it looks bad. And you can't even argue against genocide within Christianity because of this tension with the Old Testament. And therefore, you have Christian Zionists, and the Christians who are good Christians, they don't have enough scriptural leverage to really definitively refute the Christian Zionists. And obviously, the same applies to the anti-Zionist Jews, who I think are sort of, I think all these people are like Muslims with a little m, in this soteriological sense. So that's like the surface level resolution of the Islamic dilemma, right? Um, and then the way I open the book is I say that it's not actually a dilemma; it's a fractal. And
You address it directly in the book.
it's how I open the book, because it's what everybody wants to know, right?
Right.
Is
Yeah.
like,
Yeah.
how do you resolve this dilemma, which isn't a dilemma? That's a polemical thing to say. The dilemma is like, you apostate from Islam and become an atheist, or you apostate from Islam and become a Christian, is the dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's
Right.
inherently rhetorical to like, stop believing in Islam, stop believing in the not just at a Sunni level, but at the Quran level, right? So that's just polemics. So it's not really a dilemma; it's more of a conundrum. Um, with a more open ended set of interpretive resolutions. But then, as you pursue that and you zoom in, this is why it's a fractal. You get into more of these questions. So if we abandon the supersessionism, that basically monotheism was like invented by this one guy, and this is the only thing we should follow, which is what Salafism is ultimately rooted in, at the extremes, or Quran only at a more loose level of the text. And you say, okay, I grew up in Catholicism. Like when I was converting, I thought of Islam the way I was being guided into it as like Omega Catholicism. This was like a phrase that was turning over in my head, like Omega
Omega
Catholicism. And that
Catholicism.
Catholic means universal, and Omega is like the last word in universality, right? Um, so these are my biases. And then one of my key research findings, it's not a finding, but it's a theory, is what I would call a Johannine priority, which is the complete opposite of what I had imagined about the Injil in my early
No
time as a
Hanine
Muslim.
priority.
Yeah, instead of Mark in priority, like Mark came
Right.
next after John,
Right.
and then Matthew as a Mark plus Ebionites um furbishment, which got like the Great Commission verse injected into it, and it had the opening instead of today, you are my begotten son, which is quoting Psalm 2. It's just like you are my begotten son. So it's like it's just a statement of preeminent
Well,
fact instead of a quote, for one thing, which is what Mark was doing. So Mark is definitely like a Pauline influenced literary guy, and I like Mark, and it shows you this lower Christology. Um, and then the Didache is quite good. The Didache probably predates um, John, and there was a Christian guy on Muhammad's stream yesterday, and I was playing it in the car when I went to pick up my wife and kid from this library where they were having this little storytelling event. It was a nice thing for them. And my wife is like, "What are you
sounds like
listening to?
yeah.
Like everyone's so angry and violent." And it's like it's my friend's Quranism stream.
Yeah.
And this Christian guy came on, and he had Muhammad read like the beginning of the Didache, and Muhammad was like, "This is good stuff." I don't know about the rest of it, but chapter one seems really good. And then the guy started to get like really aggressive and like, oh, you guys want to chop off heads and so on. And Muhammad's like, I think you have me confused with these other Muslims. Um, so I get this kind of invective from Christians on the internet, not real, probably not the people you were hanging out with. They were probably nice Christians, right? But I get this a lot. Like I went into a
More
space.
chill. Yeah.
Yeah, I went into a space and this guy was like very rude, and he didn't really want to field me that much, except that it's interesting as a counterpoint. But he kept having these like Sunni women in, or Shia would come on because Shia think that okay, I can do a better job, right?
This was online.
This was on Twitter, yeah. And then, and then he would be really rude with the Shia guys, and then they would piss off because it's like, okay, I'm gonna lose my ad app here if I hang out with this. So like they're intentionally rude. So then they have these Sunni women in, and then they bring up hadiths and especially sexist hadiths, and then the woman's like, well, you got to think about the context, and he's like, there's no context. It's a hadith,
The
which is
Ferris.
like
Yeah.
so the thing is, like all of this Islamophobic stuff, not all of it, but much of the Islamophobic stuff from atheist ex-Muslims or from Christians or from people who have never been religious and they're just like, this is worse than, I don't like Christianity, this is worse than that. They all have like points to make that are and that overlap often with these Reformation movements, not Salafism. Salafism runs in the other direction with it, right? Um, so anyway, people are rude, not new. But the funny thing about that interlude with that guy on Muhammad's stream yesterday is that even though he went off in that direction and he's obviously Trinitarian, probably classical theology and some mainline Protestant, Catholic, whatever. Is that the Didache? James Tabor has a review of it that I was listening to a couple of months ago. Um, it it has the low Christology. There's no resurrection. They do a sort of memorialist Eucharist meal, and it has nothing to do with literally drinking Christ's blood because that would be against Torah law, right? Like you don't drink blood. Same thing in Islam. I think with halal meat, the point is it's not like a bloody steak, right? It's like a nice dry shawarma flank steak cut, right? Um, so it's consistent with Judaism in that way, right? In the fiqh level. Um, and there's none of the Trinity stuff in it, right? So then going further back, Gospel of Thomas, at this point it's totally speculative, and it's also speculative if James, the brother of Jesus, who was appointed as the first pope in the Gospel of Thomas, which we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls copy, and that Dead Sea Scrolls is dated to the 2nd century, right? So it's a copy of it's a preservation of something that was copied down, possibly from an oral tradition. So it is very speculative, and we will never know prior to the day of resurrection when what exactly came first. But just it seems like it might be Thomas, then Didache, then John, then Mark, then Matthew, then Marcion, then Luke, then Acts. So Acts would be maybe like a 3rd century text. And that also the Pauline letters, even the ones that scholars consider to be authentic, may not be. They may be a back projection, kind of like how they say, oh, Abu Hanifa repented of believing in the created Quran, like right before, this kind of a thing. Um, and and it makes you think a lot about Ilm al Rijal with the Hadith, and like like Sunnis are right that like the Hadith quote unquote science. I mean, it is some, the medieval alchemists were doing science when they were trying to like boil poop and like turn it into gold. Okay. It just wasn't that particular vein of research wasn't gonna give them femtotech, like, like even like advanced AI with nanotech, there's like femtotech is like another level. That's right. So, but they were technically poking at science just very crudely. Right. And the same is true of like Buhari adding metadata, albeit with abused heuristics, which the Quran Talk channel goes into good detail about. And then with the New Testament, it's like it's even worse because it was an earlier century, and also there wasn't any hadith threatening you with hell for doing pseudoepigrapha, right? So everybody shamelessly did pseudoepigrapha. So
Right.
this is the and of course many Muslims did pseudoepigrapha anyway, and may be condemned to hell for it, sadly. And many people follow that misguidance and may incur a lot of fisk as a consequence of the misguidance. Right, it's very sad. So the situation was even worse with the New Testament. But in that backdrop, what I've been able to decipher is that there's this pre-Johannine corpus that is fairly Quran compliant, and it's not that complicated. And what differentiates from the Torah, so this is where a lot of Sunnis gloss over it, and they say, well, and even Brother Muhammad on a stream with another Quran only guy was saying, well, it's basically anything that was in the Injil is going to be in the Quran. This is not true. And actually, what is in the Injil that's not in the Quran might be more found in the Surah of Ali alayhi salam, like when he spared Aisha, for example. And so the crux of it is that when you give mercy in the dunya, it increases the mercy you'll receive on Judgment Day. It curves the test in your favor, and that there's this deeper spiritual reality behind fiqh grading. It's not linear. And this is good news. And that's what Injil means, right? Now, in the actual
Yeah.
root of Injil, this was a market invention subverting the Roman practice of announcing good news that we have a new emperor who happens to be a demigod in this Greco-Roman mythological framework where, deities are literally procreating with women, which the Quran is very into disabusing because it persisted in, it's not unique to the Mediterranean. It also existed in probably in India and Arabia as well, right? And so Mark is subverting that while also quoting Tanakh with like Psalm 2 and Mark 1, or Psalm 22 at the crucifixion quote, right? The Zazekian atheism, like, why have you forsaken me, is not actually a lamentation of despair and losing faith right as you die, which would be an unfortunate timing for the Messiah. Suddenly he's a kafir, like right at the last minute, instead of being a martyr, never mind him being a Messiah. It would be weird, right? No, this is actually, ironically, an affirmation of his prophetic inheritance and fulfillment because he's quoting Psalm 22. which was penned by David, alayhi salam, who was also a Messiah, right? So then you have the Isaiah link. The Cyrus was a Messiah despite not being Abrahamic, for liberating the Jews. So an atheist, or which includes many Jewish scholars who practice Judaism, but their faith is very postmodern. They would say, well, this is like Cope, kind of, that, the history wasn't kind to them, and then it was, so then they came up with this. But the fact of the matter is they imported Judgment Day into their Jewish scriptural tradition, and that second Isaiah, the second part of Isaiah, is not written by Isaiah, because Isaiah lived in the 800s and this was compiled in the 500s. So it's written by some of his descendants who are like trying to assert this lineage of Hezekiah, which Isaiah married into, alayhi salam. And the point is that Zarathustra, alayhi salam, is also a prophet of God, and this is why Zoroastrians are considered Ahl Kitab in the Quran, in one of the permutations. Sometimes it's the Sabians, which are the Mandeans, who follow John the Baptist, alayhi salam. Sometimes it's the Zoroastrians. And there's a hadith where Ali answers, I think Umar was Halif, and he's like, I don't know how to treat these Zoroastrians, because they just succeeded in knocking over the Sassanid Empire. So there were a lot of new citizens they were taxing and so on as Zoroastrians. And Ali says, alayhi salam says, treat them as the people of the book. And
That'd be weird for Omar to say that when they're mentioned directly in the Quran, right?
well, Omar was not the smartest guy, and he wanted a second opinion. But yeah, that is true. That's a good point, actually. So that we don't know if that's a true quote anyway. Because it does seem obvious enough. But then again, like, I was telling a Shia guy about this, and he was like, "Wait, really? They're Ahlul Kitab?" And then the Sayyid was like, "Yeah, because he studied, he got his master's degree in comparative religion, so he's so it's just very specialized knowledge. Like, most people don't know that Zoroastrianism is the cavern basement of Islam, Christianity, Judaism, and then there's Zoroastrianism before that. But yeah, that's where we get this. I mean, the Quran says that Moses and Abraham, alayhi salam, had knowledge of Judgment Day as well, but it's not. Maybe it got lost in the shuffle, right? So Zarathustra had it, and that's where it gets reintroduced into the textual tradition that we have pre, Greek
Also
codification
seems to
of.
be throughout human traditions. So seems like every community is given some visionary who has some knowledge of the Day of Judgment and accountability in traditions all over the world, right?
Well, in the Vedic,
Whether
we
that's some
don't
like,
quite have that. I think it's more of a, and I'm not talking about the Upanishad Dharmic reincarnation forever type thing, and you try to get out of that. I'm
yeah,
talking about Vedic is more like all these pantheons, the Canaanite, the Irish, the Greek. They're all kind of samey pantheons. There's a death god and a fertility goddess and a blah blah blah, storm god and all this.
mm,
And we kill an animal, and then we serve some to the god, and then we have a party. This is like pretty much how religion was, right? So this may be like an Adamic, like the Ishmaelis talk about that. Um, so that would be like pre-Zoroastrian, right? And then there was like heaven and hell, but it kind of got lost in the mail as well. If that's like just something that happens after you die, or if it's like an eschatological compilation of everything. So the Zarathustra version is that it's this discrete eschatological event. So anyway, so that was something I didn't expect as well when I thought I was just learning about the New Testament, and then I have to look at Isaiah, and then I'm like, oh wow, Islam is actually a vast rhizomatic network.
sure.
So that was a pleasant surprise, and then I'm reviewing a lot of different apocrypha, for bits and pieces and intertextual things, and then I do the fiqh shakedown. So basically,
You
even
shake
if
down.
Acts is completely, also there's the eschatological question, which the Quran and the Quranists and Abadis reject, but Sunnis and Shias accept. And it's like, well, it's
Regarding Jesus.
hmm?
Regarding Jesus,
Yeah, that he's gonna like come
eschatology.
back before Judgment Day and kind of clean things up,
Right.
and then you get Judgment Day. So it's like nice, it's a nice thing. But there. but their contention is it's too easy. And then there's how do we parse? I think it's Surah 64. I'm not sure which Surah, which starts out that this is a clear book, and then you have this very unclear three verses. One talking about Jesus, one talking about if you were sinless, if you were like angels, we would replace you with sinful people, right? So, and then surely it is the knowledge of the hour. The it is kind of interpolated. So is it the Quran? Is it the previous verse that, God created this dialectic of sin to test people? Or is it, the verse before that about Jesus? So most Mufassirin believe it's about Jesus, and I would say maybe it's about the preceding verse. That seems like a reasonable compromise. And Quranists say it's the Quran itself, which is I think also a big leap. But irrespective of that, you go to Daniel, right? So this is where we get the discrete more than Isaiah, which has eschatological outline. It talks about the job description of the Messiah as far as spreading Abrahamic monotheism, which mission accomplished, right? And then it's like, well,
Before
Paul
we
was
get
a big
into Daniel,
so so
I do gotta get going here soon.
okay, so just real quick,
So
Daniel, the problem with
yeah,
Daniel, where it does outline like there's an Antichrist and there's this battle and all that, and the descent of like a son of man, right? Like a Bani Adam, essentially. So a humanoid, but this is interpreted
yeah,
as like a son of God, and that ties in with Mark when they're questioning him and they decide to crucify him. So this ties in with the shirk question with Christianity. And then basically Daniel has anachronism, so it seems like it's not written by a prophetic Daniel alayhi salam, and it's a Maccabean era text, which doesn't mean that there's no historical Daniel alayhi salam that lived in, I'm like throwing him the salams like in case he existed, right? That lived in the Babylonian exile period, and then the Persians conquered, and then he kept advising them, and he had this heightened level of prophetic revelation at an eschatological clarity level. It could be real, in which case expect Jesus to come back, like Islam, right? But if it's not real, then maybe Jesus doesn't come back. And it's kind of like we'll believe it when we see it, and you're not a kafir for
it's
not
kind of
knowing.
where that's kind
Yeah,
of where I'm at. Yeah, I'm.
yeah.
If it happens, I'm very cool with it. If not, I'll die before then.
Well, the good thing is
God
that
willing.
my takeaway is that this is one of those things like you're not a kafir for believing God has literal hands or metaphorical hands. You get to pick, so don't worry about if
Yeah,
it's not at that level. But don't be a kafir if Jesus comes back, right? And it'll be like easy enough to it'll be like aliens or something like level. Maybe it would be. Maybe you have to, are these aliens? You might have to suss it out a little bit, but it would be like an event. So then,
okay.
in conclusion, the other thing is about the fiqh is that Noahide laws, even if acts is the same kind of principle, even if acts is a confabulation, which it very clearly is, it has very Homeric tropes, as do some of the earlier gospels, but they turn it up with acts. It's clearly late. It's post Marcion. It is and they're trying to sideline James and kind of like keep him in the closet, but he's in it, and he says, okay, yeah, sure, they're no hides. You don't have to circumcise them, which would then weigh in on the fiqhy question of does every Muslim have to be circumcised if they're converts? Maybe not, but
Huh?
it's not in the
Huh?
Quran.
What?
And but
Yeah.
but it
No.
might be
No
there
thanks.
might be like a mitzvah in it, there might be baraka in it, so whatever. And then
Sure,
maybe you'll
there's
sin
many other
less.
things we could work on before that. Yeah.
But more than that is like,
Uh,
can they drink? Well, the Jews could drink, so that's beside the point. But can they do they, like the way Christians don't keep the Torah? Like, so sometimes Muslims will say, oh, but you Christians need to keep the Torah. No, this is a misunderstanding. So like they're all Noahides, and so are like, Hindus and so on, right? But the Hindus do idolatry, so that's breaking a Noahide law, right? So don't be a Vedantist that doesn't do, but maybe Vedantists are Ahl Kitab in Noah in the
so
the
yeah.
Shemite covenant sense, okay? So that's important because this weighs in on like Christian fiqh. So that's something that I get out of it. And
Christian fiqh. That's an interesting
then, from the usul al
idea.
din of this mutazili question of like being a Muslim on the inside and this Islamic dilemma, it's interesting that the Quran gives a pass to the Sabians, because the exclusivists say, well, what about the verse, if those who say we believe in some but not others, seeking way in between, they're going to go to hell, right? paraphrasing. But the Sabians, the Mandeans, they are like very rude about Jesus. Like they're like, he was, they think he was a shyster, basically, right? So if the Quran is giving a pass to the Mandeans, even those pre-Quran, it's like, well, they had the Injil and they rejected it, so they could just be, John the Baptist people. So that's weird, right? And you might say, no, but the Quran now is like clamping down on that. And it's like, well, if he was sent as a mercy to the world, why is he going to like suddenly make everyone go to hell? Like, isn't the mercy that there's this message of God is
Yeah,
pretty reasonable and forgives people who are willing to repent and who do good deeds, right?
absolutely.
Um,
And this was in my conversation with the Christians last night. In my conversation with the Christians last night, they were like they're struggling with the concept of like God wanted Muhammad to maintain a community with Christians and Jews governing themselves according to their laws. And they're like, well, if the Quran is against some of the things that are said in their scriptures, why would God want them to follow or why would he allow them to do these blasphemous things? And my question was like, what else do you want them to do? Like kill everyone? Like what do you like? He can't force people to join the Mohammedan Ummah,
so
right?
which verses
How,
of the
you got to
gospel
deal with
are
them.
they probably thinking of, right? They're probably thinking of like John 8, 10
On
or
stuff, yeah, things that indicate divinity of Jesus, right? And probably
yeah.
more than just the canonical gospels, probably also letters and stuff as well.
So
So
that's the most interesting part for me. Like the fiqh questions and the ilm al rijal questions are interesting. The eschatological questions are mildly interesting. It'd be more interesting when it seems like it's happening, right? But this question about theophany, because there are these theopathic hadiths in the Shia corpus from Jafar mostly, and then the Gulati become like Trinitarians about or Binitarians, I guess, and they just like lean into it. And I hang out with some of those guys. And I don't believe that hadith that says therefore I'm of them is true because I definitely differ with them on this. But yeah, I mean, there's a way that you can interpret like the Father and I are one, and nobody sees the Father, but if you have seen me, then you have seen the Father in a way that is different from Trinitarianism. But it's definitely challenging from a Zahiri Muslim perspective, right? So you have to like,
yeah, I wonder how Ibn al-Arabi deals with those types of passages, but
yeah, that's what
um,
well, like Riza Aslan said something about this. He said, well, in a Wajad al Wajud sense, like we're all God, which I thought was like very shallow. And I was like, that
I don't
makes
think
me,
that's what Ibn Arabi's saying.
no, that's
No,
like a very
Ibn Arabi
shallow
never says that.
interpretation of Wajad al Wajud, but that's Reza Aslan for you.
No,
May Allah have
right.
mercy on him. But I like him better than than other Muslims that have come up in this conversation. But yeah, I mean, that's something I want to pick apart more in contrast to Shia Hadith. I think at the end of the book, and I haven't made up my mind about quite what
Well, I
what
do
that
got to go
entails.
take care of the garden
Yeah,
right
this is a good
now,
way to
but
cap off.
it's on my list. Yeah, but fantastic. It's been too long. We should let's do it sooner next time, inshallah.
Yeah, let's do it in like maybe in like July.
Yeah, that'd be good. My schedule's pretty crazy, but I'll
Yeah, we're pretty busy
send it to
guys.
you ahead. Yeah.
Cool, man.
But it was fantastic
Mashallah. Do
talking
you
to you
have
again.
any? Because I wanted to dominate this conversation less this go around, and I think I've been mildly successful at that. So I want to give you the outro.
Oh, yeah, I guess an outro. Something I did want to bring up a little earlier about this, the middle way, about how we're reconciling uh, rationalism versus traditionalism, Mutazilite versus, and how personally I'm engaging with the tradition while still trying to like exist outside and above it in a way, or not selling my soul to it. Um, this quote from the Defenders of Reason book about the Mutazila history says, um, in their book, they says one of the arguments of this book is that both trends, rationalists and traditionalists, continue to exist and define themselves in part in relation to each other. And we will also argue in subsequent chapters that the two trends are not mutually exclusive. I think it's important to keep in mind as we traverse these different traditions that a lot of them inform each other and they couldn't exist without one another. Like Ash'ariism couldn't exist without Mu'tazilism. Although Ash'aris will characterize Mu'tazila as heretics, ultimately, like Mu'tazila thought had an irrevocable impact on Islamic theology forever, right? And the way we engage with things, and the
Well,
Islamic
this is where I'm a little
family of
arrogant
thought.
because I would say the
Oh yes,
converse is not true, but, but okay, continue.
but I think always the middle path is always the way to go. Whenever you're
Well,
stuck in between two extremes, I do think the middle path is often where it's at. Personally, this is my
yeah. I mean, I'll say this on
it's
that
almost
note is
always
that when I'm thinking about fatwa on things, I generally come at a more conservative landing than Mufti Abu Layth does. But Mufti Abu Layth made the point that
I think I do
he's
too,
he's
typically.
intentionally pushing the boundaries so that it shocks people into a surrealist
Yeah,
sort of dissolvation of these sort of unquestioned norms, and that therefore people can come back and arrive at a more calibrated thing. So that's not
yeah.
strictly
I
in
would agree with a
Mutazili. You
little.
can do that as a Maliki or as a progressive
Hmm.
Shia who have also the Mutazili Akida. Okay, that's good. I like that point. Do you have anything else you'd like to add to that?
Um, Not at the moment, but yeah, I'd be looking forward to another conversation next couple months, and we can have we'll text each other and see where we're at in our works and thoughts, and go
Are
from
there
there. I
any
think this is
other
really
tidbits
fun and
from
enjoyable.
the Night book that you think people should? Because
I
if they're
brought
probably
up
not going to read it, right?
most
So,
of them. No, I do recommend anybody, whoever listens. It's a fantastic read. There's
well,
one
now they're more
quote, I
likely to read it,
suppose. One
so that's good. I love the
it
action
is it's
figure.
incredible. Yeah, I wish I could find that excerpt, but it's in there somewhere. It's hilarious. He's a very funny writer,
Yeah, I can
which is why I
picture
like
like
him.
the beard and the like, yeah.
Yeah,
And
I
he's got like
can
movable
see.
limbs. Yeah, maybe
Let's see.
the whip that they were hitting him with. He's got it and took it
Yeah,
out of their hands.
terrible.
No, but he
uh,
actually relented and he was like, "Yeah, I believe the Quran's created. Like, let me go." And they're like, "Okay." And then he got lionized like post hoc.
yeah.
But
No,
anyway,
that's all I got for now. He actually addresses like hadith rejection quite a bit and Quran alone and how this relates to Salafia,
but I imagine
to
he
some
himself
extent.
is
But
hadith skeptical.
he's skeptical, but he says it seems reasonable to stand with scholars near the middle of the spectrum, who will have carefully argued that on a case by case basis, we might trace some reports to the generation of Muhammad's companions. So he's kind of in the middle, right?
There was a guy who called
He's
into Holid's
skeptical, but
stream and he was like, I'm starting to question like if any of this ever happened. Like maybe Aisha never or someone called into Muhammad's stream and was like, I don't even think Aisha existed or Ali or any of these guys.
I've heard
And
that this seems like an extreme political, like conspiratorial
yeah.
take.
No, but like yeah,
It's hard.
Muhammad was they both addressed it in different ways. Because I think they both like this is common enough that they both have received callers who've taken that sort of extreme position. And they're like, yeah, this is apophenia from having like rejected some commonly held things, and now you start extrapolating to everything else. So
Yeah,
don't do that. So even Muhammad, well, and it's like Muhammad is actually also Hadith skeptical. He's just role playing as Quran only. I mean, I'm from like an usul point of view, he is Quran only, and I'm pretty sure he's sincere about that. But at some level, he's like doing takia to in the same way that Mufti Abu Layth was like doing takia, that he's like so out there that he's giving like the most liberal fiqh you've ever heard. That you can make these like funny YouTube montages of it, right? And then there's the
if you listen to Mufti Abul Layth is grounded in tradition in a lot of ways. It's
oh, I
just a
mean,
way that people haven't
I
really
love it because I
don't
would
really pay
never
attention
become
to.
an ijazati, mufti. I've been studying a breadth of things, and I wouldn't go that deep in that. So I've gotten
It's
the
a lot of work.
benefit
It's a
of
lot
this.
of work.
I mean, it is. There's only so many things that one can do. And he started when he was like 20 or something, right? So
17 or 20.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Like all the Hafids I
yeah.
talked to, they all
But
started when they were 10 or 12.
very young. Yeah,
Be like
inshallah,
that.
our children will have more knowledge than we do.
And they'll
Um,
have a mapping conceptually of the Quran rather than simply knowing all the diacritic elocutions, right? Like that's the thing.
yeah, it is valuable,
Inshallah.
but yeah, for sure.
Well, that's a good note to go out
Okay,
on.
yeah.
My
May
son does
Allah
pray with
bless
me.
you and
He's going
your
on
children,
3, and he
of
climbs up on
course.
my back like Hassan would do with the Prophet.
Lovely. Yeah,
Yeah,
mine's
he's a
getting
little
older
rude,
there. Mine's
but yeah,
4.
I
He's
appreciate the
a
sunnah of
little
it.
wild. Yeah.
All right. Walaikum
God bless
salam,
you and your
bro.
family. Like Islam.
Wa
And
rahmatullah.
I pray for your prosperity down there, and
Inshallah.
for you and your children and your community and the believers all over the world. Inshallah.
Alhamdulillah, bro. It's been a
Assalamu alaikum.
pleasure. Wa
All right.
rahmatullah wa
Talk to you next time.
barakatuh. Peace and blessings.
Wa alaikum
Have a
salam wa
nice
rahmatullahi wa
afternoon.
barakatuh.
Cheers.